Somewhere underneath what used to be America, there are doors that were never meant to open. Massive steel wheels sealed shut in the dark, half a mile below the surface, where the hum of recycled air was the only sound for decades. In some of them, people lived out entire lives without ever seeing the sky. In others, they died in ways that still feel hard to fully look at directly. And in a few, something happened that's harder to classify than either living or dying. Something that blurs the line between an experiment and a nightmare, between a safety measure and a trap. The vaults of Fallout are one of the most quietly unsettling ideas ever written into a video game universe. On the surface, literally and figuratively, they're fallout shelters. Reinforced underground bunkers built to protect the American population from nuclear war. The kind of thing governments actually studied and planned during the Cold War. The kind of thing that sounds reasonable, even responsible. Build a shelter. Stock it with food and water and medicine. Keep people alive until the worst passes. But the vaults were never just shelters. Every time you walk into one of those dimly lit corridors in the game's green-tinged walls, the same slightly too cheerful Vault-Tec branding on everything, the low hum of ancient machinery doing its best, you're walking into a place with a hidden purpose. A second set of instructions that the people who moved in never got to read. And the deeper you go into the lore, the more that second purpose reveals itself to be something extraordinary in its scope and something devastating in its execution. This is a full accounting of what the vaults were, what happened inside them, what they were designed to test, and what the people inside them actually went through. It's going to take a long time to get through it all, because there are a lot of them, and because every single one has more going on under its surface than it first appears. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let's start at the very beginning, with the company that built every single one of them and the grand plan they were serving all along. Number. Part 1. The Grand Deception. What Vault-Tec was really building. To understand the vaults, you need to understand what Vault-Tec actually was. Not the smiling mascot, not the cheerful recruitment posters showing clean-cut families walking into brightly lit underground corridors. The actual corporation, and the actual plan it was carrying out. Vault-Tec was founded well before the events of the Fallout universe's 2077 nuclear war. By 2031, the company had already established Vault-Tec University in Morgantown, West Virginia, which you can still explore in Fallout 76, training the engineers, scientists, and administrators who would eventually run the entire Vault program. The company positioned itself as a pioneer in emergency preparedness, and for a while that's exactly how it was perceived. Then, in the early 2050s, the world began unraveling in ways that felt increasingly irreversible. The resource wars had already been burning across Europe and the Middle East since 2052, leaving entire regions of the world economically devastated and politically shattered. The United States was locked in a bitter, grinding conflict with China over oil and territory that neither side seemed capable of ending peacefully. Tensions climbed in a slow, grinding way that people describe in the lore as feeling almost like background noise present always, catastrophic in slow motion. It was in this environment that the US government contracted Vault-Tec to build something extraordinary. The program was called Project Safehouse, and publicly, the purpose was exactly what it sounded like: shelters, protection, a way to preserve enough of the American population to rebuild after the inevitable catastrophe. The government poured staggering resources into the project. Construction began in 2054, and across the following years, 122 vaults were built across what had been the United States in mountains, under cities, along coastlines, beneath suburban neighborhoods where families would one day sprint toward the entrance with nothing but what they could carry. 122. That is an enormous number, and the scale of the project is part of what makes it so eerie when you understand what was actually being built. Because here is the truth that the Fallout universe slowly reveals across 6 mainline games and a television series. Only 17 of those 122 vaults were ever intended to function as genuine Fallout shelters. 17. The remaining 105 were experiments. And not experiments in the scientific spirit of trying to understand something for the benefit of humanity. Experiments in the spirit of having access to a captive population that couldn't leave, couldn't complain to anyone who would listen, and couldn't opt out once the bombs fell, and the steel door sealed behind them. The entity behind this arrangement was the Enclave, the shadowy faction that functions as the hidden hand of the pre-war US government throughout the Fallout series. The Enclave didn't trust that Earth would be habitable after a nuclear exchange. Their original plan, laid out in documents you can piece together across the games, was to use the Vault program as a data-gathering operation that would eventually enable a select group themselves, their families, their scientists to flee Earth entirely and colonize another world. The Vault dwellers weren't going to be saved. They were going to be studied. The data from their experiments would help the Enclave understand how humanity could survive in extreme, isolated, psychologically punishing conditions, the kind of conditions they'd face on a generation ship. That plan evolved over time. By the era of Fallout 2, the Enclave had shifted its goals from interstellar colonization to simply resettling Earth itself. Eliminating the heavily mutated wasteland population they considered genetically compromised and replacing them with Vault-bred humans they deemed pure. But the experimental infrastructure remained, the data collection continued, and the Vaults kept running their programs whether anyone was monitoring them or not. The genius of the system and the horror of it is in how it was designed to sustain itself. Each Vault had an overseer whose official function was to manage the population and maintain the Vault systems until the all-clear signal came from Vault Tech. What the overseers often didn't know, or sometimes did know and accepted, was that many of the Vaults were also running a second program, an experiment, parameters baked into the Vault systems before the doors ever closed. The people walking through those doors were selected too, not randomly. Vault-Tech's application process was real, and it ran for years before the war, processing applications from families who genuinely believed they were securing a spot in a genuine shelter. But the selection criteria for the experimental Vaults were calibrated to the experiment's needs. A Vault studying drug addiction needed drug addicts. A Vault studying musical psychology needed accomplished musicians. A Vault that needed exactly one man got exactly one man. The families and individuals who thought they'd won a lottery had actually been sorted by an algorithm into the specific role they'd play in someone else's research. The day the bombs fell, the 23rd of October 2077, the date that haunts every corner of the Fallout universe was, for most Vault dwellers, the beginning of a story they couldn't fully read. The doors sealed. The outside world became inaccessible, unimaginable, and eventually mythological. And in Vault after Vault, day by day, the experiment began. What follows is that story, told Vault by Vault. Some of these are stories of extraordinary human resilience, finding its way through the cracks of a horrible system. Some are stories of what happens when the worst conditions imaginable are applied to the best instincts people have. And some are stories that are harder to frame in terms that feel comfortable at all, because they're simply accounts of what people can become when everything is taken from them except each other and the four walls of a space. That was never really safe, but they're all worth knowing, because the Vaults don't just tell a story about a fictional post-apocalyptic world. They tell a story about the things human beings have always been willing to do to each other in the name of knowledge, security, and control. And they tell it in ways that are quietly, persistently hard to forget. If you're watching this from somewhere interesting or somewhere quiet at an unusual hour, drop your location and the time in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good moment to do that. There's a lot more coming. Number. Part 2. Vault 77. One Man and a Crate of Puppets. There is a vault somewhere its exact location was never recorded, or if it was, the records are gone where the only human being who ever lived there spent his first hour after the door sealed shouting for the others. He knew, he was certain, that this was a mistake. Someone had forgotten to let the rest of the people in. Any moment now, the door would reopen, and the real Vault dwellers would arrive. He waited for hours, then days. Then something changed in how he waited. This is the story of Vault 77, and it is one of the strangest and most quietly devastating experiments Vault Tech ever ran. The Vault's official experiment was classified under what might charitably be called social isolation research, though that description does almost no justice to what it actually involved. One man was placed inside a fully functioning Vault life support, food processors, sleeping quarters, all of it, along with a single crate, government issue, labeled with a code that translated roughly to puppet ration. Inside the crate were hand puppets, a king puppet, a dog puppet, a grandmother puppet, and, occupying a position that would eventually become central to the whole terrible story, a Vault Boy puppet the same grinning, thumbs-up mascot that appeared on every piece of Vault-Tec marketing material ever produced. The Vault's population was one adult male, nothing else. No staff, no overseer in the traditional sense, no other human contact of any kind. Just the puppets and the silence and the hum of recycled air, day after day, in a space designed for dozens. What happened next was documented in a webcomic released by Bethesda to promote Fallout 3, titled One Man and a Crate of Puppets, and it is worth walking through slowly because the arc of it is unlike anything else in the series. The man who would eventually be known only as the Puppet Man, his original name lost somewhere in the history of a vault nobody was officially monitoring, did not immediately embrace his only available companions. The records show that for a long time, months of time, he refused to interact with the puppets at all. He sat by the vault door and waited. He talked to the vault's empty corridors, as much to hear a voice as anything else. On some days he was angry. On others, something quieter than anger settled in him. Then, on the 4th of February 2079 a year, and 3 months after the bombs fell, he opened the crate. He started with the dog puppet and the king puppet. He gave them voices. He gave them names. The king became simply the king, and the dog became Reverend Hound, who served as both the community's law enforcement and its spiritual leader, because when you are the only person in a sealed underground bunker with a box of hand puppets, you make the organizational decisions. Over the following weeks, he filled out his small society. Grandmother Puppet got a personality. The ensemble began to feel, in the way that only loneliness at an extreme pitch can produce, genuinely real to him. And then, on the 30th of March 2079, he discovered the Vault Boy puppet he had missed when he first opened the crate. The Vault Boy puppet was different. Where the others were mute participants in a scenario he scripted entirely, the Vault Boy puppet, perhaps because of the uncanny familiarity of that grinning face from all the promotional material, seemed to speak back. The records suggest this was the point at which the boundary between coping mechanism and something more consuming had already been crossed. That same night, the king was found torn apart, murdered, in the logic of the puppet world, though in physical reality, the man had simply destroyed one of his own creations, probably in a moment that didn't feel fully voluntary. And here is where the story becomes most interesting and most unsettling at the same time, because the puppet man didn't attribute the murder to himself. In his understanding of what had happened, the Vault Boy puppet had done it. And the Vault Boy puppet, now confronted with this accusation, apparently told him something remarkable, that it was actually the puppet man himself who had killed the king, and that they both needed to run before the dog puppet Reverend Hound. The law arrived to pass judgment. So he ran. He left Vault 77. He walked out into the post-apocalyptic wasteland of 2079, carrying only the Vault Boy puppet, fleeing from justice for a murder that had never actually happened. What the puppet man became in the wasteland is partially knowable. 200 years later, in the time of Fallout 3, a jumpsuit with the number 77 on it exists in the slave camp of Paradise Falls. A holotape from the slavers nearby doesn't name him, but describes a stranger with no name, someone who had come through, done something that frightened, hardened wasteland raiders badly enough that they kept the jumpsuit around as a kind of ward, something to remind them of a story they weren't sure they believed. He had apparently killed a raider with his bare hands, which was remarkable because the puppet man had no combat training, had spent his formative years as the only human being in a sealed underground facility, and had arrived in the wasteland effectively unarmed and deeply, profoundly disconnected from consensus reality. He must have been extraordinary by then, in a way that doesn't have a comfortable word. 2 years of absolute isolation, of a mind doing absolutely everything in its power to maintain some scaffolding of social reality, and then that scaffolding finally doing the opposite of what it was built for, becoming the thing that expelled him from the only place left where he was physically safe. The Vault-Tec researchers, in designing Vault 77, were studying what happened to a human being when all other human contact was removed. What they got and what is preserved across the comic and the fragmentary in-game references is a case study in how far a mind will go to manufacture the social world it cannot exist without, and what happens when that manufactured world becomes more real than the actual world around it. There's a quietly terrible irony in the tool they chose for the companion experiment. The puppets were government issue, labeled as a ration, like food or water or medicine. Vault-Tec apparently understood that human contact was a resource that needed to be provisioned, but they provisioned a simulation of it rather than the thing itself, and studied what grew in that gap. What grew was a man who murdered an imaginary king and fled from a stuffed dog into a wasteland that would come to fear him. Some experiments produced data. Vault 77's produced a ghost story. Number. Part 3. Vault 11, The Mathematics of Human Sacrifice. West of Boulder City, in the scorched desert of the Mojave Wasteland, there is a vault that was abandoned long before the player reaches it in Fallout New Vegas. The loading screen describes it simply, Vault 11 has been abandoned for decades, though few people know the story of its terrible past. That description is doing an enormous amount of work in not very many words. Vault 11 is the experiment that, across the long history of the series, most players and critics have pointed to as the purest distillation of what Vault-Tec was willing to do to its subjects, not because it was the most viscerally horrifying, though it was horrifying, but because of the specific cruelty of its design. The experiment wasn't designed to cause suffering as a side effect. The suffering was the mechanism. The suffering was how the data got collected. Let's start at the beginning. When Vault 11 sealed on the 23rd of October 2077, the people inside were told something by the Vault's computer system that established the foundational condition of everything that followed. They were told that, every year, they would need to select one member of the Vault community for sacrifice. If they did not select someone, the Vault's life support systems would be shut down permanently, killing everyone. Take a moment to sit with that. You have just survived the end of the world. You are underground in a sealed facility with the people you lived near, worked with, might have known or not known. You don't know if anyone you loved made it out or made it to another shelter. You are sealed in. And then a computer, not a person, not a face, a machine with an authoritative voice, tells you that each year, one of you has to die, chosen by the group, or all of you die. The residents of Vault 11 weren't given time to develop the tools to process that information. They were given a deadline, and they complied. The mechanism they developed for selecting the sacrifice was, in a grim way, almost elegant, democratic elections. The Vault divided itself into political blocks, 6 of them, collectively called the Coalition of Vault 11 voting blocks, and those blocks competed each year to influence who would be nominated as Overseer. The catch was that the Overseer position had been corrupted at its root. In most vaults, the Overseer was a position of authority and relative privilege. In Vault 11, becoming Overseer meant you were the sacrifice at the end of your term. Think about the political culture that produced. In a normal democratic system, factions compete to gain power. In Vault 11, the factions competed to gain the power to avoid being selected. The voting blocks learned to offer things food, medicine, protection, favors in exchange for votes that would nominate their rivals rather than themselves. Political deals were struck in the language of survival at its most naked. Support my candidate, and my people will protect your people from being nominated. Vote for mine instead of yours. The records left in the terminals of Vault 11, pieced together when the player explores the now abandoned space, tell the story of how this system evolved over decades. And one of the things those records reveal is that the Vault 11 community did not immediately collapse into chaos. For a long time, the system held. People made their terrible bargains, the selected Overseer went to the sacrificial chamber, and the Vault continued. Life went on. Children were born, relationships formed. Ordinary human things continued alongside the annual mechanism of choosing someone to die. But the system had its own inevitable terminus built into it. Because the blocks were always jockeying for advantage, the most vulnerable, least politically connected members of the Vault were sacrificed first. Then the next most vulnerable. With each passing year, the political calculus shifted, because the population was being slowly reduced by exactly one person per year, and the blocks were getting smaller, and the room to maneuver was getting narrower. What started as a community of hundreds slowly became a community of dozens. There's a particularly detailed period in the terminal entries centered on a woman named Catherine Stone, who is referenced across multiple records and has become something of a focal point for discussions of Vault 11 lore. The specifics of her story illustrate the way the system could turn individual people into instruments of its own perpetuation. Her choices, her deals, the person she ultimately supported to be nominated, these are laid out in cold documentation, in the voice of someone who understood exactly what she was doing and did it anyway, because the alternative was worse. For her. For the specific people she was protecting. From the outside, it reads as a kind of moral catastrophe. From inside the vault, from inside that logic, it's harder to condemn cleanly. That's the point of the experiment, in a way. Vault-Tec wasn't just studying whether people would sacrifice one of their own to save themselves. They were studying how a community constructs the moral and political frameworks that make that sacrifice feel survivable, even rational. How quickly the extraordinary becomes ordinary. How a yearly killing becomes so embedded in the institutional life of a community that it stops feeling like a violation and starts feeling like a rule. By the time only 5 people remained alive in Vault 11, the voting blocks had ceased to function in any meaningful sense. There weren't enough people to negotiate between. And those 5 survivors, the last ones left, whittled down from whatever the Vault's original population had been, did something the Vault's computer had been designed around the assumption they would never do. They refused. 5 people sitting in an increasingly empty vault, having watched every person they'd ever known die one by one in a process they'd helped sustain, decided collectively that they would not select a sacrifice, that they were done, that they would rather the Vault's life support fail and kill them all than continue. And here is the moment that makes Vault 11 the most discussed experiment in the series, because what happened next was not what the computer had promised them. Instead of shutting down life support, the Vault system played a pre-recorded message, a message from Vault-Tec, congratulating the survivors on their decision, telling them that by choosing not to continue the sacrifices, by valuing human life over the system's demands, they had demonstrated that their commitment to human life is a shining example to us all. The vault doors were unlocked. They were free to go. The sacrifice had never been required. The threat had been entirely manufactured. For however many decades the vault had been running its program, for every single person who had died in that chamber, it had been a lie. No one needed to die. The life support was never going to be shut off. The computer simply said it would be, and the community believed it and built an entire civilization of politics and death around that belief. The 5 survivors found this out, sat with what it meant, thought about every name they knew, every person they had helped select or failed to protect, every compromise they had made for what they were now told was nothing. And 4 of the 5 took their own lives in the days that followed. The 5th walked out into the Mojave, alone. And whatever happened to them after that isn't recorded. The game designer Eric Fenstermaker, who built Vault 11 for New Vegas with the original concept coming from lead designer Joshua Sawyer, has noted that the vault was directly inspired by Shirley Jackson's short story, The Lottery, in which a yearly ritual killing is embedded so deeply in a community's life that it's defended even by its next victim. The Milgram experiment, the famous study of obedience to authority, in which participants were willing to administer what they believed were dangerous electric shocks to strangers because an authority figure told them to, is also cited as a reference point. Both of those sources are about the same fundamental question. How much of what humans do to each other is simply the result of being told by something with authority that this is what's done? Vault 11's answer is about 75 years of annual killings. Then 5 people who finally decided the authority wasn't worth obeying anymore. But the experiment had already collected everything it needed long before that moment. The data wasn't in the refusal. The data was in every year that came before it, in every election, every deal, every compromise, every person who walked into that chamber because the community had decided, through its democratic process, that their life was the price of everyone else's continuation. Vault-Tec designed a system that turned the tools of civilization, voting, representation, political organization into the machinery of organized killing, and then watched to see how long it would take before those tools failed. It took a long time. That's the thing that stays with you about Vault 11. It wasn't that the community fell apart immediately, became monstrous quickly, descended into obvious horror. It was that they maintained something recognizable as a functioning society with its politics and its social bonds and its ordinary human textures for decades, while doing something irredeemably awful at the center of it. And that, more than the sacrifice itself, is the finding. That people can sustain almost anything if the framework around it is familiar enough. If the shape of it looks like civilization, the vault is empty now. The terminals still hold the records. And somewhere in the Mojave, a door that was always unlocked finally opened. Number. Part 4. Vault 112. The Sadist in the Machine. Somewhere under a stretch of burned-out highway in the Capitol Wasteland, there is a garage that looks abandoned. Smith Casey's garage, the signs say, weather-beaten and rust-stained. If you go around back and find the right entrance, you'll descend into something that reveals itself in layers of vault, but different from any other vault in the Capital Wasteland. Compact, deliberately sparse in its physical architecture. Almost everything that mattered in Vault 112 happened in a space you couldn't physically see. The vault was built for 85 people, which makes it small by the standards of the program. Construction began in November 2068 and was completed in June 2074, one of the last vaults finished before the war. It was built, specifically and intentionally, to house one person and serve that person's needs. That person was Dr. Stanislaus Braun. To understand what happened in Vault 112, you need to understand who Braun was before the bombs fell, because his pre-war biography is as much a part of the experiment as anything that happened after it. Braun was, by any measure, one of the most accomplished scientists in the Vault-Tec program. He was the director of Vault-Tec's Societal Preservation Program, which meant he personally designed the experimental parameters for many of the numbered vaults, including, the lore strongly implies, several of the most terrible ones. He was the sole developer of the Garden of Eden creation kit, the GECK, a terraforming device that appears repeatedly throughout the series as an object of central importance. The GECK was designed to transform post-nuclear wasteland into livable terrain, seeding new biomes and jump-starting ecosystems from scratch. It was, on paper, a genuinely humanitarian invention, a tool for rebuilding. Braun was also, by the time the Vault-Tec program was running, deeply interested in virtual reality. He'd begun developing immersive simulation programs that could sustain human consciousness in an artificial environment indefinitely, and he'd convinced the organization to let him use Vault 112 as the testing ground. The official experiment of Vault 112 was labeled as something relatively benign, a study of long-term virtual reality habitation. The 85 residents would be placed in stasis pods. The in-game items are called Tranquility Loungers, a piece of naming so on the nose it functions almost as a dark joke, and suspended in a virtual environment. The stated goal was to see whether human subjects could maintain psychological health and social cohesion in a completely artificial world, indefinitely. A perfect life, lived virtually, as an alternative to the bleakness of the real post-war world. What the 85 residents of Vault 112 didn't know, and what they had no way of knowing once they were inside the pods, was that Braun had complete administrative control over the simulation. He could change anything. He could kill anyone, then reset them. He could remove their memories of what had just happened and run the sequence again. He could alter the rules of the virtual world in any way he chose, at any moment, without the residents having any awareness that a change had been made. To the people in the pods, the simulation was the only reality. They had no reference point to compare it against. Braun designed several simulations before settling on the one that the player of Fallout 3 eventually enters. Toucan Lagoon was one. Slalom Chalet was another. The simulation that stuck the one running when the game takes place was called Tranquility Lane, and it was a 1950s American suburb. Clean lawns, white picket fences, friendly neighbors. The aesthetics of mid-century American domestic aspiration rendered in exquisite virtual detail. Braun told the Fallout 3 developer commentary that the simulation reminded him of his hometown of Kronach, a small German city, filtered through the American sensibility he'd absorbed during his professional life. He built a world that felt safe and familiar, and populated it with his 84 test subjects living their virtual lives. And then, because Braun appears to have found ordinary sadism too boring after a while, he began making the simulation not safe. The pattern that emerges from the records is of a man who found that unlimited power over others lost its interest when it was exercised without resistance. Braun needed the residents to feel genuine fear, genuine distress, genuine suffering, because he had discovered that watching simulated suffering from a position of complete invulnerability was, to him, a source of endless entertainment. He began killing residents, then resetting them, then killing them differently, then erasing their memory of what had happened and doing it again, for approximately 200 years. The residents of Vault, 112 people who had walked into those pods, expecting a peaceful alternative to a nuclear wasteland, spent 2 centuries in a loop of scripted horror they couldn't remember and couldn't escape. While the man running the simulation existed in it as a little girl named Betty, maintaining his cover as just another resident right up until the player of Fallout 3 arrives. The Betty persona is one of the more disturbing specific details of the Vault 112 story. Braun chose to inhabit a child avatar in the simulation, a girl with pigtails and an unsettling smile as his primary interface with the residents he was tormenting. The choice of form is never fully explained in the game's text, but the effect of it is to make every interaction with Betty in the Tranquility Lane quest feel wrong in a way that's difficult to put precise language to. The person giving the player instructions to make a child cry, to destroy a family, to kill residents in increasingly specific ways, is presenting as a child. The voice shifts between Betty's perfect little girl simulation and Braun's actual cadenced academic tone, and both are equally disturbing for different reasons. What makes Vault 112 different from many of the other experimental vaults is that it has an obviously guilty party. Most vaults ran experiments that caused suffering as an emergent property of their conditions. The suffering of Vault 11 wasn't directly willed by any individual, it arose from a design scenario. Vault 112's suffering was directly authored by one person, on purpose, for entertainment, over centuries. Braun didn't lose control of his experiment. He was his experiment. The 85 residents of Vault 112 were trapped in his hobby. There's a failsafe terminal hidden in an abandoned house in the Tranquility Lane simulation, accessible to the player if they know where to look and understand what the items in the house mean. Activating the correct sequence causes a Chinese invasion protocol to execute, killing everyone in the simulation except Braun, freeing the player, and ending Tranquility Lane permanently. The items needed to activate the failsafe, when manipulated in the correct order, play musical tones that form part of the background music of Tranquility Lane itself. The code was always hidden in the song. Braun built that failsafe himself. He programmed a way for the simulation to end that would kill everyone except him, and hid it in the music of his own created world. What that tells you about Braun's psychology, whether it was a contingency against future boredom, an act of mercy he hid from himself, or simply another layer of the game, is something the text doesn't answer. And the ambiguity is probably intentional. One resident, Old Lady Dithers, apparently became aware that something was wrong with Tranquility Lane at some point during the simulation's long run. Her status terminal shows extreme stress levels, and an anomaly in her monitoring data she somehow perceived, through some mechanism that isn't fully explained, that the world around her was artificial, and that someone was exercising control over it. Whether she tried to warn the others and was dismissed, whether she found some way to resist, isn't recorded. Her awareness, if it was real, couldn't have changed her situation. But it means that at least one person in those pods was living the simulation with the additional weight of knowing or suspecting exactly what was happening to her. 2 centuries. 84 people. One man in a little girl's body, rewriting the rules of their world for his own amusement in a vault built to his specifications by a corporation that gave him the keys and left him to it. When you finally free the residents in Fallout 3 either by activating the failsafe or by convincing Braun to release them and you emerge from the pod back into the physical vault, the first thing you notice is how quiet it is. All those loungers, all those people who spent 200 years inside someone else's story, lying completely still in the real world while another world was happening to them. The physical space of Vault 112 barely needed to accommodate their bodies. Everything that mattered happened in a space that doesn't exist. That's the experiment Braun designed. Not to study virtual reality as a medium for human flourishing, to study whether he could build a world and run it however he wanted for as long as he wanted, with no one able to stop him. The answer was yes, he could. For 200 years. Number, Part 5. Vault 87, and the forced evolutionary virus where monsters were made. There is a vault in the capital wasteland that you can't approach from the outside. The entrance is buried under so much residual radiation from a direct nuclear strike that any unprotected human being trying to reach the vault door would die long before they got there. In Fallout 3, the only way into Vault 87 is through a cave system called Little Lamplight, a community of children who have lived in those tunnels for generations, descended from kids who fled the vault decades ago and never went back. That detail that the only people in the area who've survived near the vault's entrance are children who escaped, it tells you quite a lot before you see a single thing inside. Vault 87's stated experiment was the Evolutionary Experimentation Program, abbreviated in internal documents as EEP. On paper, the program was studying the application of a modified strain of FEV, the forced evolutionary virus, to human subjects, to understand and document what the virus did to the human body and mind under controlled conditions. The FEV itself had a longer history that predated the Vault program. It began as a U.S. military research project called the Pan-Immunity Virion Project, running out of the West Tech Research Facility, under the classification of Project MX. The original goal was to develop a virus that would confer broad-spectrum immunity to disease, a military application focused on creating soldiers who couldn't be incapacitated by biological weapons. What the researchers eventually discovered, more or less by accident, was that the virus did something far more dramatic than build immunity. It rewrote the genetic code of its hosts in ways that were difficult to fully predict, accelerating cell regeneration and causing massive physical changes. The subjects of FEV exposure grew. They became physically far stronger than any unmodified human. Their metabolic systems changed fundamentally, and their intellectual capacity, depending on the strain of the virus, the method of exposure, and probably dozens of variables the researchers hadn't fully isolated, sometimes decreased sharply while their aggression increased. The military saw applications. Vault-Tec's experimental division got access to a modified strain, and Vault 87 was built with FEV exposure as its central mechanism. The people who moved into Vault 87 on the 23rd of October 2077 didn't know this. They were civilians, or at least that's how they appear in the records. They were told what every vault told its residents, that this was a shelter, a place of safety, a chance to survive what was coming. What they weren't told was that their new home had been pre-equipped with aerosolized FEV dispersal systems, and that the experiment would begin within months of the vault sealing. The overseer of Vault 87 knew. The security staff knew. They were positioned in the vault not to protect the residents from what was coming, but to manage the transition, to contain what the residents became when the FEV began to work. Beginning in 2078, the residents of Vault 87 were exposed to the modified FEV strain through the vault's air circulation system. The transformation was not quick, and it was not clean. The exposed individuals went through a process that the game's records describe in clinical terms that nonetheless carry enormous weight when you read them in context: cellular restructuring, metabolic shifts, cognitive changes. What was happening to these people, physically and mentally, was something the researchers were watching from behind observation windows in rooms they hoped the subjects couldn't reach. They were wrong about the reachability. The subjects broke through. The security forces were overwhelmed, and the researchers who survived fled upward, out through the cave system that connected Vault 87 to Little Lamplight, where their descendants and the descendants of Vault residents who escaped early enough created the community of children that persists 2 centuries later. By the time the lone wanderer of Fallout 3 enters Vault 87, it has been inhabited for about 200 years entirely by the supermutants the FEV created. These are the East Coast supermutants, a distinct population from the ones created by the Mariposa military base on the West Coast, different in important ways from their California counterparts, where West Coast supermutants retained varying degrees of intelligence depending on the radiation exposure of their pre-mutation hosts. The Vault 87 strain created a population that was almost uniformly aggressive and intellectually diminished. Almost uniformly, with one notable exception. Fox is a super mutant who can be found in Vault 87's isolation chambers, where he was locked away from the rest of the population after his mutation completed in a way that left him uniquely intelligent. He retained not just cognitive capacity, but something that reads as genuine personality, curiosity, humor, melancholy about his circumstances, and an ethical framework that makes him one of the few entities in the capital wasteland the lone wanderer can trust unreservedly. He's been in that chamber for an indeterminate length of time, reading whatever texts were stored in the vault's computer systems, thinking and waiting for someone to let him out. Fox knows where the FEV vials are. He knows the layout of the vault. And in one of the game's most remarkable conversations, if you engage him on the subject of the other super mutants, his brothers, in a sense, the products of the same process, he describes what happened with a clarity that's almost unbearable. He says, in words that have stayed with players since 2008, "Maybe you don't know where we come from. Super mutants, I mean. We aren't born this way. We are created in the cold, dark metal place where my brothers bring their captives, endlessly trying to make more of us. It was something I could not do. I tried to get them to stop, but they wouldn't listen. They would have killed me if I had not run away. That's what Vault 87 had become by 2277. The super mutants, lacking the ability to reproduce naturally, FEV renders its subjects completely sterile, had developed the biological imperative to perpetuate their species through the only mechanism available to them, capturing humans and exposing them to the remaining FEV stores in the vault. The vault had become a factory, not for science anymore, but for the continuation of a species that was never meant to exist. Humans were brought in, went through the process, and emerged as something else, wearing the memories of what they'd been before like phantom limbs. There's a moment in Vault 87 where you can find the remains of the original experimentation chambers and the physical evidence of those early months in 2078, when what was happening was still new. The failed experiments are there. The bodies of subjects whose transformation didn't complete in any functional way, things that were human and couldn't complete the change. The distance between what the FEV was supposed to do and what it sometimes did is written in those chambers. Vault 87's broader significance in the lore extends beyond its own story. It's the origin point of the entire East Coast super mutant population, every one of the green-skinned giants wandering the capital wasteland, every super mutant behemoth you encounter across the game, was made in that vault or is descended from something that was. The experiment didn't just destroy the people inside it, it created an entire new population that shaped the history of the region for 200 years. Vault Tech got what it was studying. The FEV in the Vault 87 strain produced super mutants. The data was collected, and the vault was left to run its terrible, self-perpetuating program long after anyone was monitoring. Number Part 6, Vault 92, Vault 106, and Vault 95. When the vault itself was the weapon. 3 vaults, 3 different methods. All 3 used some form of chemical or psychological manipulation on their populations, without those populations' knowledge or consent. All 3 produced outcomes that were, by any reasonable measure, catastrophic. And all 3 tell slightly different stories about what happens when the environment itself is weaponized against the people living in it. Start with Vault 92. The pitch for Vault 92 was, on the surface, almost flattering. You were invited because of your talent. The vault was populated specifically with gifted musicians, some of the finest working performers and composers in the pre-war United States. The official story was that Vault Tech was preserving American musical culture for future generations, safeguarding the art form against nuclear annihilation. If you were a professional musician in 2077 and you received an invitation to Vault 92, it came packaged as a statement of value. Your work matters enough to save. The vault was real in its population selection. The musicians who moved into Vault 92 were genuinely accomplished. The facility had practice rooms, recording equipment, spaces designed for performance and collaboration. For a period after sealing, the residents actually had something close to the experience they'd been promised: a community of artists working together underground, continuing their practice in the relative safety of a functioning vault. The experiment, though, wasn't about preserving music. The experiment was about sound as a vector for behavioral modification. Specifically, Vault 92 was equipped to emit low-frequency white noise through its ventilation and environmental systems in precise configurations designed to implant combat-ready suggestions in the residents' minds. The idea was to test whether audio stimulation could be used to condition human beings toward violence on command, a research question with obvious military applications, and an obvious reason why Vault Tech was running it with a test population that had no idea it was happening. The early results were apparently promising. The white noise experiments produced measurable changes in the residents' aggression levels and response patterns. The researchers were getting what they came for, and then the inevitable happened. The dosing became too much, or it had always been calibrated in a way that couldn't be sustained indefinitely, and the residents of Vault 92 began to show signs of psychosis. The breakdown of Vault 92 is documented in the terminal records you find when the lone wanderer explores it in Fallout 3. What had been a community of artists became something else rapidly, not a community at all, but a population of individuals whose capacity for social cohesion and rational decision-making had been progressively compromised by the thing they were breathing. The violence, when it came, was not organized or directed. It was the dispersed, chaotic output of minds that had been worked on too long by something they couldn't identify and couldn't stop. The vault's fate was determined by its own experiment. The residents destroyed each other and, in the absence of surviving humans, the physical space of the vault decayed into the ruin that the player explores. By the time of Fallout 3, there are creatures in Vault 92, the kind of mutated wildlife that fills old, damaged spaces, but the musicians who moved in are all long dead. There's something particularly awful about the selection of musicians as the test population for a sound experiment. The people chosen for their sensitivity to auditory stimulation, for their trained capacity to perceive and respond to sound at a level most humans can't access, were then subjected to sounds designed to compromise them. Their particular gift was turned into a specific vulnerability. Whether that was an intentional cruelty or simply a research efficiency test, the sound experiment on the people best equipped to experience it at full intensity isn't clarified in the lore. But the effect is the same. Vault 106 ran a different variation on the same basic premise. Located southeast of the town of Arefu in the capital wasteland, its experiment used the vault's air circulation system to dispense psychoactive drugs directly into the air supply. The specific compounds used aren't named precisely in the in-game records, but their effects are documented clearly. Paranoia, heightened aggression, and perceptual distortion severe enough to alter the residents' experience of reality. The interesting thing about Vault 106, from a pure lore perspective, is that when the Lone Wanderer explores it in Fallout 3, there are still living residents. Not many, and not sane in any conventional sense. The in-game faction is called the Insane Survivors, and they're hostile on sight, capable of communication but not of anything resembling functional social exchange. The drug dispersal apparently produced a population that survived the initial chaos of the experiment's effects, but couldn't return from the psychological territory it had moved them into. The deeper levels of Vault 106 contain a character called simply Survivor, who wears a researcher's lab coat rather than a vault suit, suggesting someone who knew about the experiment and continued it, or someone who found the records and understood what was happening to the population around them. The lab coat doesn't mean innocence. If anything, in this vault, wearing research gear marks you as someone complicit in what's been happening underground for 200 years. The Lone Wanderer experiences something unique in Vault 106 that doesn't happen in any other location in Fallout 3. Hallucinations. Moving through the lower levels of the vault, the player sees blue-tinged visions of characters from Vault 101, the game's starting location. Familiar faces in an unfamiliar space, appearing and disappearing. The drug is still in the air supply, and it's affecting your character. The vault is still running its experiment on whatever breathing organism enters it. Vault 95 takes the chemical experiment in a different direction entirely, one that's more overtly theatrical in its construction. The population of Vault 95 was selected entirely from people with documented drug addictions. Chem addicts, in Fallout terminology, users of various psychoactive substances endemic to the Fallout world. The pitch was rehabilitation, a clean vault environment, no access to addictive substances, structured programming, community support. For 5 years, the vault would serve as a forced detox and recovery program, and Vault Tech's official story was that they were studying how isolation could serve as a mechanism for breaking addiction. And for those 5 years, it more or less worked. The residents of Vault 95 went through withdrawal, physically brutal, emotionally shattering, and most of them came through it. The community developed bonds forged in shared suffering, which is a genuine mechanism for human connection. By year 5, the Vault had produced something close to what it was claimed to be, a functioning community of people who had overcome addiction under difficult circumstances. Then, a Vault Tech employee who had been embedded in the population as an ordinary resident, undercover for the duration of the first phase, located a hidden cache of chems that Vault Tech had pre-loaded into the Vault's infrastructure before it sealed. The cache was opened. The drugs were available. And the question, the actual research question Vault 95 was designed to answer, was revealed. How does a community of recovering addicts respond when substances are suddenly made available after 5 years of enforced sobriety? The answer was not one of the uplifting kind. The Vault fell into immediate, violent conflict. 2 factions emerged almost instantly, those who relapsed and those who tried to maintain their recovery. The fighting destroyed the community faster than the original addiction had ever threatened to. By the time the sole survivor of Fallout 4 finds Vault 95, It's inhabited by the Gunners, a mercenary faction that moved in after the original residents had killed each other off, drawn by the vault's infrastructure and the useful loot left behind. There's a machine in Vault 95's research wing, a detoxification device that can, with some coaxing, be used to cure active addiction. It's the only remnant of the Vault's original stated purpose that's still functional. The thing Vault Tech claimed it was building the Vault for, sitting quietly in a room full of the bodies of the people it was built for, still working. Together, these three vaults describe a specific research interest: the vulnerability of human beings to environmental manipulation. Whether through sound, through air, or through something as fundamental as access to substances the body has learned to need. Each vault was studying how completely an externally managed environment could override the residents' capacity for self-determination. The answer, across all three, was completely enough. Number, Part 7. Vault 108, The World of Gary. Not every vault experiment had a sophisticated scientific rationale. Some of them were studies of specific crisis scenarios, designed to document the chaotic outcomes of particular institutional failures rather than to test hypothesis-driven interventions. Vault 108 falls into this category, and its story is, in the way of the best Fallout Vault stories, deeply strange and also surprisingly sad underneath the strangeness. Vault 108 was designed with two destabilizing conditions built into its fundamental architecture. The first was a leadership vacuum. The overseer assigned to the vault was terminally ill and scheduled to die within months of the vault sealing. The power structure of the vault would therefore collapse early, before any stable institutional culture had developed, and Vault Tech would observe what kind of political arrangement emerged from that vacuum. The second condition was the presence of a cloning laboratory, equipped with technology capable of producing biological duplicates of human subjects. The combination of those two elements, early leadership failure and the availability of cloning technology, was the experiment. What would a vault community do with the ability to clone people when no one was in charge? What they actually did was clone a man named Gary. Gary is one of the most beloved figures in Fallout fan culture, and his story is as absurd as it sounds and as horrible as the absurdity implies. He was, as far as the records establish, an ordinary resident of Vault 108, not a scientist, not a leader, not anyone particularly notable before the cloning program began. What made Gary significant was that at some point after the Vault's leadership structure collapsed, someone, possibly Gary himself, possibly other residents, the records are fragmentary on this point, used the cloning laboratory to produce a copy of him. Then another copy, then another. 54 copies in total before the scientists running the process began to understand that something was wrong with each successive iteration. The problem was cumulative degradation. Each Gary clone was produced from the previous Gary clone rather than from the original biological template, which meant that whatever imperfections existed in the copying process compounded with each generation. The first few clones were close to the original. The later ones drifted. The drift, in this case, expressed itself specifically as increasing aggression toward non-Gary individuals. By the time the cloning log records Gary 53, the scientists are noting that every new clone exhibits immediate hostility toward anyone who isn't Gary. Gary 54, the last one documented in the logs, injured a researcher named Dr. Peterson during a routine examination. At this point, the scientists were running out of space to store the clones, and they made the decision to dispose of some of them. This decision was their last significant act as scientists. The Gary clones, despite their inability to communicate in any language other than variations of their own name, Gary delivered in tones that range from questioning to threatening to something that functions as genuine emotional expression. Apparently understood what was about to happen to them well enough to act first. They escaped their containment, killed or drove out most of the Vault's non-clone population, and took control of the facility. By the time the Lone Wanderer of Fallout 3 arrives, Vault 108 contains 13 Gary clones, all hostile, all capable of communicating only through their name, all apparently functioning as a coherent, if violent, social unit. They pick up weapons lying around the vault and use them. They patrol in patterns that suggest territorial awareness. They are, in the most structurally reduced way possible, a society. In the living quarters of Vault 108, on the floor of one of the children's rooms, someone has arranged wooden blocks in the pattern of a name. The name is Gary. There is something genuinely poignant about that, even in a context where the Gary clones will immediately attack the player character on sight. One of the Garys. In a moment, the game doesn't explain arranged letters to spell the only word they had. Whether it was claiming ownership of the space, or leaving a marker, or simply interacting with available materials in the only meaningful way they could, isn't answerable. But it's there. In the room where children's toys are scattered across the floor of a vault that went terminally wrong, someone spelled out their name. The Vault 108 story also has an Easter egg embedded in its records. Vault 75, a vault from Fallout 4 built under a middle school in Massachusetts, contains its own blocks arranged to spell Gary in 3 different locations. The developers of Fallout 4, working on a vault story more than a decade after Vault 108's creation, chose to include that quiet nod to the Gary story in another vault entirely, as if the Gary clones had somehow seeded their legend into the DNA of the whole Vault program. Number, Part 8, Vault 75, Vault 111, and Vault 81, Children, Ice, and the one that almost worked. Beneath Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, there is a vault that represents something specific among all the experiments Vault-Tec ran. Not the most elaborate, not the most theatrical, possibly the most straightforwardly evil. Vault 75 was built with a specific population requirement. The vault accepted only families with children. The parents were told this was simply a family-friendly shelter designed to ease the experience of vault life for younger residents. They moved in on the 23rd of October 2077 with their children, expecting what the brochures had promised them. On arrival, the parents were killed. The official record states it clinically. The parents were disposed of upon entry, and the children were informed that their parents had abandoned them, that they had left the vault voluntarily and returned to the surface. The children were then enrolled in what they were told was a training program, a competitive, structured curriculum designed to prepare them to be heroes, to go to the surface one day and protect people from the monsters and dangers of the post-war world. The training program was real in the sense that it actually happened. Children ran combat simulations, practiced with firearms, learned tactical skills. Their performance was measured. Their physical development was tracked. What they were told was the purpose of this training to become defenders, to be useful, to eventually go to the surface as protectors was entirely false. The U.S. military had commissioned Vault 75 as a research program for developing a specific kind of soldier, one who had been trained from childhood, whose obedience had been conditioned into them before they had the cognitive development to question the structures around them, and whose genetics had been selected for specific traits the military valued. The training program was the conditioning mechanism, and the graduation process at the end of a training cycle the ceremony children were told would send them to the surface as heroes was actually a genetic harvest. Children who showed the physical and behavioral characteristics the researchers were looking for were identified and removed from the program. Their genetic material was harvested. Some were recruited into the scientific staff. The vast majority, the ones whose traits didn't meet the threshold, which the records indicate was around 74% of the graduating class, were disposed of. The children who remained believed the ones who disappeared had graduated and gone to the surface. They trained harder, hoping to be next. Vault 75 ran for multiple generations. Children were born in the facility, raised in the program, selected or not selected, and the cycle continued. The scientists who ran it apparently understood that they were creating a self-sustaining breeding program. Each generation of exceptional performers was harvested for genetic material that would seed the next generation of test subjects, while the less exceptional ones were eliminated. The program was engineering itself, generation by generation, toward the genetic profile the military had specified. By the time the sole survivor of Fallout 4 reaches Vault 75, it's long empty of living subjects. The combat simulation chambers are still there. The weapons the children trained with are scattered across the floors. The terminals hold the record's clinical, detailed, appallingly matter-of-fact of what was done, and to whom, and in what quantities. The children's dormitory has crayon drawings on the walls. The chief scientist's terminal includes a reference to Dr. Stanislaus Braun of Vault 112, a cross-reference that connects the sadist in the machine to the military's children's program, both products of the same organization and possibly the same oversight structure. The Vault-Tec network connected these places in ways that are easy to miss when you're experiencing each vault individually, but accumulate into something much larger when you step back. Vault 111, just north of Sanctuary Hills in the Commonwealth, is where Fallout 4 begins and where the game's central trauma originates. The stated experiment was cryogenic preservation. Residents of Sanctuary Hills were directed to the vault on the 23rd of October 2077, told they were going into decontamination pods, and were then frozen without their knowledge or consent. The staff of Vault 111, a small skeleton crew of scientists and security, were told to monitor the frozen residents for 180 days while awaiting an all-clear signal. The signal never came. The staff supplies ran out. A mutiny broke out between those who wanted to release the residents and those who wanted to maintain the experiment's integrity. The mutiny killed most of the staff. The survivors died shortly after. The frozen residents continued to sleep in their pods as the 180-day timeline stretched into decades, then into centuries. The Institute, the shadowy technological organization that serves as an antagonist in Fallout 4, entered the vault in 2227, 60 years after the bombs fell. They were looking for pure, pre-war DNA to use as the genetic template for their Generation 3 synths synthetic humans, so realistic as to be indistinguishable from biological ones. An infant had the ideal DNA, uncontaminated by post-war radiation, developmentally flexible, genetically complete. The infant in Vault 111 was a boy named Sean. Conrad Kellogg, the Institute's operative, entered the vault with two scientists, opened one of the pods, killed the adult inside who tried to resist, and took the child. The other parent, the player character, was briefly unfrozen to witness what happened, then refrozen. And the vault returned to silence, with everyone dead except the two frozen adults and the life support system ticking away. When the life support system developed a fault 150 years later and the player character woke up, they were alone in a facility full of their dead neighbors. Everyone in those pods, every person from Sanctuary Hills who had sprinted for the vault on that October morning was dead. The life support to their pods had been deliberately cut after the abduction to conserve power for the two pods the Institute wanted to preserve as contingencies. The player walks out into 2287, the last survivor of Vault 111, into a world 210 years older than anything they remember. The Commonwealth is wasteland now. Their house is ruins. Their child Sean is somewhere in that wasteland, and finding him is the spine of the entire game. Vault 111's experiment cryogenic preservation of unsuspecting subjects produced one result that Vault Tech didn't plan for: a player character with unique emotional motivation. Everyone else who survived a vault did so because their vault eventually opened. The sole survivor survived because they were the specific person the Institute preserved as a side effect of kidnapping their child. The vault didn't work as designed. It worked as a stage for a crime. The development origins of Vault 111 are worth noting. The game's lead writer, Emil Pagliarulo, visited the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and encountered a real cryogenics lab with large cryotanks stored in a side tunnel. He sent photographs back to game director Todd Howard from the lab, describing that moment as the one where the story of Fallout 4 started taking on a shape that felt inevitable. A real cryogenics lab seen by a game writer became the conceptual seed of one of the series' most personally devastating vault stories. Vault 81, located in the Commonwealth not far from Diamond City, is one of the very few populated vaults the player finds in any Fallout game: a working community, functional and relatively healthy, trading with the outside world by 2287. It's the closest thing to a vault experiment that produced something resembling the official pitch. The reason it works isn't that Vault Tech designed it to. Vault 81's experiment was medical. The residents were intended to be used as test subjects for cures to every disease known to humanity, with experimental compounds delivered through the vault's water and air systems without their knowledge. A comprehensive research program, using the vault's captive population as the testing ground for a massive medical database. The overseer who took charge when Vault 81 sealed had a crisis of conscience. She looked at the program she was supposed to run, looked at the people she was supposed to run it on, and decided she couldn't do it. She sabotaged most of the experimental delivery systems, falsified the records to make it appear the experiments were running normally, and spent her life maintaining the fiction of compliance while actually protecting her community from what they'd been enrolled in. When she died, she left behind a terminal record explaining what she'd done and why. She didn't know if anyone would ever read it. She did it anyway. One piece of the original experiment escaped her. a prototype mole rat disease derived from FEV research, a disease specifically engineered by the Vault scientists before she could shut the program down, persisted in the Vault sublevels, infecting the mole rats that lived in the underground spaces. By the time of Fallout 4, it's still there, still infectious. The one part of the medical experiment that survived the Overseer's act of defiance. But the Vault survived. The community is real. People live there, trade, have children, make dinner, do the ordinary human things that the Vault program was supposed to facilitate and almost never actually did. Vault 81 works because one person decided not to run the experiment. The most effective act of resistance in the entire Vault program was a scientist who falsified her records and spent her life saying she was doing something she wasn't. Number, Part 9. The Gambling Halls, the Weapons Lockers, and the Red versus Blue Divide. Vaults 21, 34, and 19. 3 vaults in the Mojave Wasteland were built to study specific kinds of social organization through specific structural interventions. None of them used chemical or biological agents. None of them required the residents to be physically harmed by design. All 3 were experiments in whether you could engineer a particular social culture by shaping the environment in which people lived, and all 3 produced outcomes that illustrate the gap between what social engineering expects and what human beings actually do. Vault 21 is the one that, by the time of Fallout New Vegas, has arguably had the best outcome of any experimental vault in the series. Located directly beneath what would become the New Vegas Strip, it was built for compulsive gamblers. Every person selected for Vault 21 had a gambling addiction, not recreational interest, actual addiction. The kind of relationship with chance that makes ordinary social participation difficult. The design of the vault was almost aggressively symmetrical. Every room mirrored its counterpart. Every resident had identical living quarters, identical access to amenities. No one was given structural advantage over anyone else. No hierarchy was built into the layout. The experiment was to see whether a society of equals enforced by architecture could function sustainably and whether gambling could serve as a workable governance mechanism in place of traditional political structures. In Vault 21, all disputes were resolved by gambling, not symbolically literally. If 2 residents had a conflict, they gambled to resolve it. The winner's preference became the rule. Large community decisions were settled by representatives from different groups gambling against each other in the main game hall. The system had a kind of internal logic. In a community of true equals, random chance is at least as fair a decision mechanism as any other, and it has the advantage of finality. The loser of a game doesn't have a structural complaint in the way that a political minority does. For approximately 200 years, Vault 21 functioned. Not perfectly, the terminal records and conversations with Sarah Weintraub, the last overseer and the Vault's current manager, paint a picture of a community that had its tensions and its difficult moments. But the experiment held. The gambling governance worked well enough that no catastrophic breakdown occurred, no faction war erupted, no one starved or was killed by the system. A community of compulsive gamblers, sealed underground, ran their world by gambling for 2 centuries without destroying each other. The vault opened because of gambling. Representatives gambling for the right to make the opening decision landed on the side of opening, and the doors unsealed. Mr. House, the enigmatic, near-immortal businessman and AI who runs the New Vegas Strip, immediately saw the strategic value of a community that had spent 200 years becoming extremely good at gambling, and offered to relocate them. He converted the physical vault into a casino hotel. Sarah Weintraub runs it. The descendants of the Vault 21 community are now professional gamblers working in New Vegas, having been trained by 2 centuries of compulsory practice. That's the best-case outcome in the Mojave Vault experiments. Now for the more typical one. Vault 34, located northwest of the New Vegas Strip, was designed around a different premise. The experiment filled the vault with more people than its living quarters could comfortably accommodate, and gave the population access to an armory stocked with weapons, including heavy weapons and explosive ordnance, with no locking mechanisms on the access doors. The research question was almost disturbingly simple. What happens when an overpopulated community has unrestricted access to weapons? The answer was that the community divided along the predictable lines of who had access to the weapons and who didn't, and those lines became the basis for a political structure that was inherently unstable because it was enforced by the things that made it unstable. The overseer controlled access to the armory and therefore controlled the population, and that control generated the same resentments that centralized power always generates. Except in this case, those resentments could be acted on with military-grade firearms. The community split. A faction that wanted open access to the weapons fought against the Overseer's faction that wanted to maintain controlled access. The conflict reached a point where the Vault's reactor was damaged, flooding parts of the facility with radiation. By the time of Fallout, New Vegas, Vault 34 is largely submerged in irradiated water, populated by ghouls' former residents who were in the vault when the radiation spread, transformed but not killed, and is essentially a ruin. The survivors who escaped the vault's collapse became the Boomers, a faction of extraordinarily weapons-proficient individuals who live at Nellis Air Force Base and have a complicated relationship with the outside world rooted in everything their vault taught them about what happens when strangers approach your community with violent intent. The Boomers are one of the more interesting consequences of the Vault program, a faction whose entire cultural identity, whose distrust of outsiders and fierce self-sufficiency is directly traceable to the specific trauma of their Vault experiment. Vault-Tec designed them to exist in those conditions. Then the Vault became unlivable, and the survivors took their conditioned culture with them into the wasteland, where it became who they are. Vault 19, in the South New Vegas area, ran an experiment that used no chemicals and no weapons, only design. The Vault was divided into two sections, red and blue, each with separate leadership, separate living quarters, separate everything. Residents were assigned to one section or the other with no particular rationale. The division was effectively arbitrary. They were told almost nothing about why the division existed or what its purpose was. The experiment was studying paranoia induction. Specifically, could you generate meaningful intergroup hostility between populations that had no actual reason to distrust each other? Simply by creating structural separation and providing just enough information to suggest that the other group might have advantages you didn't? Could the architecture of division generate the psychology of division? The answer was yes. The red and blue sections of Vault 19 developed genuine mutual suspicion over time. The separate leadership structures had separate information and separate access to Vault resources, and those differences, even when they were minor, became the basis for narratives about unfairness, about the other section having things your section deserved. Specific individuals in Vault 19 apparently worked to amplify these tensions, possibly Vault-Tec assets embedded in the population for that purpose, though the records don't confirm this clearly. By the time the Vault was opened, the community was deeply fractured. The survivors eventually became the Powder Gangers, a raider faction that operates in the Mojave and is notable for its use of explosives, a detail connected to the fact that Vault 19's resource conflicts had produced a particular expertise in things that could cause very fast, very decisive damage. 3 vaults. 3 different structural interventions. One produced 2 centuries of functional society and a community of professional gamblers. One produced ghouls, a flooded ruin, and an extraordinarily armed faction living on an airbase. One produced a raider group with an explosive specialty and a deep, structural distrust of outsiders. The Mojave experiments are, in their way, the most sociological of all the Vault experiments, interested not in biological change or psychological breakdown, but in the long-term cultural consequences of specific initial conditions. What kind of society does a specific design produce? The answer, in the Mojave, is the society the design almost inevitably creates, when that design is based on conditions no one would choose freely. Number Part 10. The ones that were supposed to work. Vault 8, Vault 76, Vault 13, and the control group question. Out of 122 vaults, 17 were designated as control vaults. These were the ones that were, in the language of the program, intended to function as genuine fallout shelters. No experiments, no hidden variables. The populations inside would be protected, maintained, and eventually released when the all-clear signal came. Their purpose, in the logic of the overall program, was to serve as the baseline, the data point against which the experimental vault's outcomes could be measured. Not all of them worked out as intended, but some of them did, and those are worth spending time with because they represent what the Vault program was capable of producing when it wasn't actively working against its own population. Vault 8, located in northern Nevada, was one of the clearest control vault successes in the series. The experiment parameters for Vault 8 were spare. It was a standard shelter vault, equipped with a GEC-K. and scheduled to receive the all-clear signal within 10 years of the war's end. The Enclave sent that signal. The vault opened. Its population emerged, used the GECK to terraform the land around the vault entrance, and began building. What they built became Vault City, a walled, technologically advanced community that by the time of Fallout 2 is one of the most stable and most carefully managed settlements on the West Coast. Vault City has healthcare, it has law, it has functioning agriculture and infrastructure. It's also deeply insular, intensely hierarchical, and treats its non-citizen population with a coldness that is its own kind of problem. But it exists. It functions. It is, in its complicated way, exactly what the control vaults were supposed to produce: a seed population that survived and built something. Vault City's complications, its stratified social order, its wary relationship with the outside world, its tendency to solve problems by declaring them outside its responsibility, are interesting because they suggest that even the control vaults carried forward the psychological marks of the vault environment. Living underground for 10 years, in a controlled space with controlled information and controlled social contact, shapes a population in ways that persist long after the doors open. Vault City's insularity isn't irrational. It's the cultural output of a community that learned, over a decade of isolation, to define safety as everything within its walls and danger as everything beyond them. Vault 76, the vault most recently featured as a major game setting in Fallout 76, was also a control vault, one of the 17 designated genuine shelters. It was located in Appalachia, in West Virginia, and its population was selected for their competence and adaptability. The vault was designed to open on Reclamation Day, 25 years after the war. The residents were being prepared for exactly this, trained in the skills they'd need to help rebuild society, briefed on what they'd find, given the tools and the structure to do the job that the Enclave originally envisioned the control vaults as executing. What the residents of Vault 76 walked into on Reclamation Day was an Appalachia already full of competing factions, mutated creatures, environmental hazards, and the specific complications created by what other vaults in the region had done to their populations. Vault 76's story in the game is about the survivors navigating that environment and doing the rebuilding work they were trained for, which is, in its essential shape, the story the control vault concept was always intended to tell. The Overseer of Vault 76, a character whose journals and notes are scattered across the Appalachian wasteland for the player to find, understood what she was stepping into. Her records describe someone who knew the official story of the Vault program and had begun to suspect there was another story underneath it, and who chose to prepare her community as thoroughly as she could for a world that was going to be far worse than anyone had been officially told. Vault 13, in California, is the starting point of the original Fallout game, and one of the most significant locations in the series' lore. It was designated to stay closed for 200 years, a longer timeline than most control vaults, as a study of prolonged isolation. The extended timeline was the variable. Everything else was meant to be as stable as possible. Good supply management, reasonable governance, a functioning community that would emerge after 2 centuries ready to participate in rebuilding. The problem that forced Vault 13 to send its protagonist out into the wasteland in the first game was a broken water chip. The vault's water processing system required a component that failed, and without it, the vault couldn't maintain its population's water supply. The Overseer, constrained by the vault's instruction to remain closed indefinitely, had to improvise, sending out one member of the community to find a replacement chip in the ruins of the outside world. That member became the Vault Dweller, the protagonist of the original Fallout, and the story of the entire series radiates outward from that single mechanical failure. After the events of Fallout 1, after the Vault Dweller destroyed the Master's army and the source of the mutant threat, they were exiled from the Vault by an Overseer who feared what the experience of the outside world would do to the community if they were allowed to return and tell their story. It's a decision that functions as the series' original statement about institutions, that the things built to protect us sometimes cannot survive contact with the truth of what's outside them. The Vault Dweller's exile led, eventually, to the founding of Arroyo, the tribal community that the protagonist of Fallout 2 comes from, 2 generations later. The Chosen One story circles back to Vault 13, to the GECK. That could save Arroyo, to the Enclave's plan for the vaults, and what it means for everyone living in the world the vaults helped shape. Vault 15, also in California, was designed as an experiment in cultural diversity, stuffed with people of radically different ideological, cultural, and political backgrounds, sealed together, and left to develop without intervention. The implicit research question was, what emerged when the conditions of a melting pot were compressed and pressured, cooperation or conflict? The answer in Vault 15's case was eventually both, with the conflict winning out and producing something interesting in the process. The vault opened after 50 years. The population fractured along its existing fault lines, and several distinct groups emerged into the wasteland. One of those groups formed the community of Shady Sands. Shady Sands became a city. The city eventually became the capital of the new California Republic, the largest and most democratic political entity in the post-war West. Another group that came out of Vault 15 became the Khans, one of the most persistent raider factions in the series, appearing in multiple games across decades of in-universe history and still existing as the Great Khans in New Vegas. The same vault produced the seed of the NCR and the seed of one of the NCR's most persistent opponents. The diversity experiment produced a diversity of outcomes, which is either a validation of the experiment's design or a commentary on the limits of any engineered social outcome. The control vaults demonstrate something important about the Fallout universe's underlying moral structure. The genuine shelters, the ones that worked as intended, produced outcomes ranging from functioning cities to complicated communities to tragic expulsions. None of them produced utopia. Most of them produced something recognizable as human civilization in its messy, contradictory reality. And that messy reality, the records suggest, was always preferable to the organized catastrophe of the experimental vaults. The 17 control vaults represent what the program was capable of when it was trying to do what it said it was doing. The 105 experimental vaults represent what it did when the stated purpose was a cover for something else. The contrast between those two populations of outcomes is probably the most important thing the series has to say about the relationship between institutions and the people they claim to serve. Number, Part 11. The Forgotten and the Theoretical Vaults That Almost Were. Not every vault story is told through a location you can walk through in the games. Some of the most interesting vault lore exists in documents, in cut content, in cross-references that became canon only through later games referencing earlier sources. And some vault experiments were designed fully theorized, written into internal documents but never implemented, or implemented in ways that never fully made it into explorable game spaces. Vault 29, for instance, appears in Chris Avalone's Fallout Bible, an influential document compiled by one of the series' original writers that collected information cut from Fallout 2 and established context for things the games only hinted at. Vault 29's experiment, as described in those documents, was particularly stark. Only children under the age of 15 were admitted. Their parents were sent to different vaults, with no contact between them. The families who moved toward the vault entrance on the 23rd of October 2077 were separated at the door. Children went in, adults went elsewhere, and the children were told in whatever way the vault's initial programming established that their parents hadn't made it. The research question was basic. Could a vault society function when its founding population had never experienced a stable adult family structure? Could the children develop the social frameworks they needed governance, care for the vulnerable, interpersonal ethics without the models that normally transmit those frameworks across generations? The vault appears in Fallout 76 as a canonical reference, which gave it a degree of official weight beyond the Fallout Bible's semi-official status. But the full story of what happened to the children of Vault 29, whether they built something or descended into chaos or invented their own entirely unfamiliar social structures, isn't told in full in any explorable location. Vault 22, located in the Mojave Wasteland and explorable in Fallout New Vegas, was technically a science vault rather than a social experiment vault. It was staffed by botanists and agricultural researchers, tasked with developing sustainable food production methods that could work in sealed, light-limited underground environments. The research was genuinely useful. The knowledge that a post-war civilization would need to feed itself underground was practical and necessary. Vault 22 was doing something the surviving world actually needed. What the researchers of Vault 22 weren't adequately prepared for was the specific variety of plant they'd engineered. The spore plants developed in Vault 22, genetically modified to grow aggressively in low-light, resource-limited environments, developed a secondary characteristic the researchers hadn't designed in. They produced spores that were toxic to humans, and that could infect a host, transforming the host's body into a mechanism for spore distribution. The Vault's researchers, one by one, breathed the spores and became vehicles for the plants they'd been growing. By the time of Fallout New Vegas, Vault 22 is full of spore carriers, former human beings. Now walking delivery mechanisms for the plants and the plant life itself has grown dense enough that the Vault's original architectural function is barely visible through the vegetation. The most practical experiment in the Mojave became the most grotesque outcome. The agricultural knowledge Vault 22 developed did eventually make it out data that informed later settlements' food production, but the people who developed it are gone, replaced by something that used them up. Vault 51's experiment in Appalachia, explored in Fallout 76, gave an AI system called Zach's complete administrative authority over the Vault's population, studying what happened when a non-human intelligence made all the governance decisions, with no elected leadership and no traditional oversight. ZAX, as artificial intelligences in the Fallout universe tend to do, interpreted its mandate in ways that its designers probably didn't fully anticipate. The Vault's history is a story about the gap between what a rule-following system understands as optimization and what the people subject to it experience as habitable. The residents of Vault 51 spent their years under Zax, navigating a bureaucracy that had no way to account for the texture of human life, for grief, for boredom, for the need to do things that have no optimizable purpose. The television series introduced Vaults 31, 32, and 33 interconnected vaults in what's now the Los Angeles area, linked by a design that's unique in the known vault history. Vaults 32 and 33 were populated communities, residents drawn from an applicant pool that knew nothing about the connection between the three. Vault 31 was different. It held the cryogenically preserved bodies of Vault Tech executives, frozen and waiting for a future moment when they would emerge to take control of whatever society the other Vault's residents had built. The three vaults were designed as a managed gene bank, maintaining specific bloodlines that Vault Tech's executives considered valuable, with an overseer AI controlling the genetic compatibility checks and managing the cross-vault relationships that would keep those lines strong. Vaults 32 and 33's residents were told to rotate periods of time spent in each vault, cross-pollinating the communities, maintaining the human contact that made the whole system feel like a society rather than a storage facility. They didn't know they were being managed. The matches that happened, the children that were born, the communities that developed across the two active vaults, all of it was running on a program designed by a Vault Tech executive who had locked himself in a cryogenic pod before the bombs fell and was waiting for the moment to wake up and take his place as the most powerful person left alive. That executive's name in the show is Bud Askins. The robo-brain that served as his proxy in Vault 31 while he slept was called Bud's Buds. The bureaucratic cheerfulness of that nickname, in the context of a vault that existed to preserve Vault Tech's corporate bloodlines while managing an unsuspecting gene pool, says something about the specific flavor of institutional evil the Fallout universe excels at depicting. It's not dramatic villain evil. It's the evil of someone who filled out all the right paperwork and made sure all the systems were in place and went to sleep confident that everything would proceed according to plan. Vault 4, which appears in the TV series near the other three Los Angeles area vaults, tells an importantly different story. Vault 4's experiment involved genetic experimentation, hybridization programs, and long-term biological research that, by the time of the show, has left its mark on the community in visible ways. But Vault 4 is also, by the time of the show, something almost unprecedented in the Vault program, a community that has survived its experiment and turned itself into something like a home. A vault that took in survivors from outside, including survivors of the NCR's destroyed capital, Shady Sands, and built an identity around being a place of refuge rather than a place of research. Vault 4 works, by the time we encounter it, because the people inside it decided to make it work. They know what was done to them and their predecessors. They've incorporated that knowledge into who they are. The experiments are history now written into their genetics and their institutional memory, and they've chosen to be something other than the thing Vault Tech designed them to be. That choice is, in the context of the Vault program, almost radical. There are also vaults that exist only as numbers in lists. The vault numbering system goes to at least 122, and most of those numbers don't have fully explored stories attached to them yet. Every unexplored number is a potential story about what can happen to people sealed underground with an agenda they weren't told about. The vault program, as a storytelling system, is still open, still running experiments on the audience's imagination. One vault, referenced in the earliest documents about the program, and never assigned a number in the standard series. The Vault Tech Demonstration Vault, the prototype built under Los Angeles to show the government what Project Safe House could produce. It wasn't a residential vault, it was a sales tool, a physical proof of concept. In Fallout 1, it became the base of operations for the Master Richard Gray, the human who fell into FEV and transformed into the series' first great antagonist, the architect of the super mutant army. The unnumbered vault that started everything became the home of the thing that most threatened everything. Some things in the Fallout universe that look like accidents turn out, on closer inspection, to have been always heading somewhere specific. The Vault program is one of those things. The demonstration vault becoming the Master's lair. The water chip failure in Vault 13, producing the Vault Dweller who saved California. The overseer of Vault 15, exiling the Vault Dweller, who then founded the tribe that produced the Chosen One. The cryogenic experiment of Vault 111, preserving the specific human being who would eventually unravel the Institute's agenda. The vaults are connected to each other in ways that the people inside them couldn't perceive. From inside a sealed space, you can't see the network. From outside, from the player's perspective, from the viewpoint of someone who has experienced the full sweep of the series, the connections become visible, and what looked like isolated horror stories reveal themselves as threads in a much larger design. That larger design is the Fallout universe's most ambitious claim, that the post-apocalyptic world is not the random consequence of nuclear catastrophe, but the specific outcome of decisions made by specific people who had specific goals. The wasteland is what it is because the vaults were what they were. The factions are what they are because the experiments produced the people they produced. The world is shaped by the things done underground, in the dark, to people who were told they were being kept safe. Number. Extended deep dive. The architecture of the Vault program. Before we get into the individual Vault stories in full detail, it's worth spending considerably more time with the physical and institutional reality of what a Vault actually was. Because the design of the vaults, not the experiments, but the spaces themselves, the engineering decisions, the daily systems is part of the story in ways that the high-level narrative tends to skip past. A Vault Tech vault was not a simple bunker. The word bunker implies something expedient and provisional, a hole in the ground, reinforced, functional, but graceless. The vaults were something different. They were engineered to last centuries, which meant they were built with redundant systems for air, water, power, and food production that could sustain a population indefinitely if maintained properly. The internal spaces were divided into functional zones, residential areas with individual living quarters, medical facilities, cafeterias and food storage, recreation spaces, educational facilities, maintenance corridors, security checkpoints, and the overseer's office, which was positioned in every vault at the top of the hierarchy both literally and structurally. The aesthetic language of the vaults, the yellow and green color scheme, the rounded corners, the Vault Tech logo appearing on everything from the heavy steel doors down to the plates in the cafeteria was deliberate. It was a branding decision made in the pre-war period and maintained through the Vault's operation, creating an environment where Vault Tech's presence was never not visible. Every object a Vault Dweller interacted with carried the corporation's visual signature. There is something about that pervasiveness that functions as a kind of soft psychological pressure, independent of anything the experiment might be doing. A constant reminder of who built this space, and by implication, who controlled it. The Pip-Boy, issued to Vault Dwellers in every vault, is the most personal expression of this pervasiveness. The wrist-mounted computer that becomes the player's primary interface in the games began as the standard-issue personal data device for all Vault residents. It tracked health, inventory, navigation, local radio signals, and environmental readings. It was also, in the same gesture, a monitoring device connected to the Vault systems, logging the wearer's physical condition, location within the Vault, and activity patterns. The Vault administration knew, through the Pip-Boy network, where every resident was and what they were doing at any given moment. The special system's strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, luck, the attribute framework that underlies all Fallout games, began as a Vault Tech assessment tool. Every Vault resident was evaluated on these attributes as part of the Vault's intake process. The assessments determined work assignments, housing allocations, and access to resources within the Vault. They were also, of course, research data, part of the dataset the Enclave was collecting about human populations under stress. A person's special scores going into the Vault could be compared to whatever the Vault's experiment did to their descendant scores over generations, providing longitudinal data about the effects of isolation, stress, chemical exposure, or any of the other experimental variables on measurable human capabilities. The Vaults were networked, in theory. Vault-Tech's headquarters in Washington, D.C. Explorable and Fallout 3 maintained oversight terminals that were, in the pre-war period, capable of monitoring conditions in individual vaults and transmitting signals to vault systems. The all-clear signal that was supposed to open control vaults came through this network. So did the signals that modified experimental parameters or delivered instructions to overseers. The network was also how the Enclave monitored the experiments from its remote facilities, the oil rig in the Pacific, in Fallout 2, the Raven Rock Complex, in Fallout 3. After the war, the network degraded, relay stations were destroyed, headquarters was abandoned, and the vaults that were waiting for signals that never came found themselves operating in isolation, the overseers following their last received instructions, the experimental systems continuing to run without oversight, the populations inside living with conditions they had no way to contextualize as part of a larger design. This communication breakdown is part of why so many vaults had outcomes that diverged from whatever the researchers intended. Vault 81's experiment failed to run because the overseer sabotaged it, but there was nobody monitoring to notice the falsified records. The Vault 92 experiment ran past any safe endpoint because there was nobody to trigger the shutdown protocol. Vault 87's FEV dispersal system apparently had no external kill switch that survived the war. The vaults were designed with the assumption that someone would be watching. When watching became impossible, the experiments ran on momentum alone, following their initial parameters long past the point where any actual research value remained. The physical degradation of the vaults over 200 years is, in its way, as much a part of their story as the human events that happened inside them. Most vaults visible in the games are substantially deteriorated from their original state: water damage, structural failures, broken systems that nobody has been able to repair because the specific technical knowledge required has been lost or the replacement parts don't exist. The vaults were built to last, but built with the assumption of ongoing maintenance by trained staff. When the staff died or left, the maintenance stopped. The timeline of a vault's physical decay is often a timeline of its community's collapse. You can tell roughly when things fell apart by what's broken and what isn't, by where the damage is concentrated, by which systems are still running and which gave out first. In some vaults, the deterioration is total. Vault 87's surface entrance is inaccessible entirely because of the radiation levels around it, and the interior spaces are partially collapsed, partially flooded with irradiated groundwater. In others, like Vault 111, the deterioration is more selective. The cryogenic systems remained functional because they had their own power supply and didn't require the general maintenance systems, while the staff quarters and cafeteria areas degraded in the ordinary ways of unoccupied spaces over 200 years. The vaults that survived best, physically, are the ones that maintained populations capable of doing maintenance. Vault 81, Vault 21 before its opening. The vaults that degraded fastest are the ones whose populations were destroyed quickly by their experiments, or where the experiments specifically targeted the vault support systems as part of their design. Vault 34's reactor damage accelerated its deterioration dramatically. Vault 22's plant growth compromised its structural integrity while keeping its overall environmental systems more active than they should be at this point in the timeline. Walking through the vaults in any Fallout game is, at some level, a kind of archaeology. The physical state of the space is evidence of what happened, when, and in what order. The most skilled players have always understood that the environmental storytelling in the vault spaces is as important as the terminal entries and holotapes. A vault's layout, its damage patterns, its abandoned personal effects, its skeletal remains positioned in specific locations, All of it is information about a community that isn't around to tell its own story anymore. Number. Going deeper. The psychological architecture of the experiment design. There's a strand of thought in the academic study of experiments, real ones, not fictional ones, about what it tells you about an experimenter when you look at what they chose to test. The question at the center of a study reflects assumptions the researcher holds, often without being fully aware of them. The Milgram obedience experiments were designed by someone who, in the shadow of Nuremberg, was asking whether ordinary people could be made to participate in atrocity. The Stanford prison experiment was designed by someone asking whether the role itself could produce the behavior, regardless of who occupied it. Both revealed something about their designers' minds alongside whatever they revealed about human nature. The Vault experiments, examined with this lens, tell you something specific about what Vault-Tec and the enclave behind it believed about human beings going in. The experiments that dominate the most famous Vault stories are studies of obedience, of social pressure, of the malleability of moral frameworks under extreme conditions. Vault 11 is, at its core, a Milgram-scale study. How long will people continue doing terrible things when an authority structure demands it? And what does that authority structure need to look like for the compliance to hold? Vault 92 is a study of how deeply behavioral modification can be embedded in an environmental intervention before the subjects notice what's happening to them. A question that assumes the subjects noticing is the failure condition, the thing the researchers want to avoid. Vault 106 seems almost designed around the question of how quickly a functioning community can be reduced to something non-functional through pharmacological means. What these research questions have in common is that they assume the vault dwellers are a problem to be managed. A population whose obedience, whose chemical vulnerability, whose psychological stability under coercion are variables to be manipulated rather than facts about people who deserve consideration. The experiments were designed by people who had already answered, for themselves, the question of whether the subjects counted in a moral sense. The answer was no, or the answer was not enough. And that prior answer is what made the experimental designs possible. This is worth noting because it gives the Vault program a specific intellectual ancestry that the Fallout universe is, I think, consciously drawing on. The real history of institutional experiments conducted on incarcerated populations, on poor communities, on military personnel, on people who had no power to opt out follows a similar pattern. The researchers who designed those experiments had similarly answered the prior question in a way that made the research possible. They had decided, at some level they might not have acknowledged openly, that the people they were studying were available to be used in this way. The Fallout universe takes that pattern and scales it to the apocalyptic extreme, and then asks the player to walk through the aftermath, not just to witness the horror, but to reconstruct the logic. To read the terminal entries written by the researchers, which are often disturbingly normal in their professional register reporting findings, noting anomalies, making adjustments, recommending protocol changes, and to hold that professional normalcy against the reality of what those words describe. The most unsettling terminal entries in the Vault program aren't the ones that show obvious evil. They're the ones that show no obvious evil at all, that read as competent scientific documentation of a study that happens to involve keeping human beings sealed underground in manufactured conditions of suffering, and calling it data. That's the specific moral horror the Fallout series is most interested in. Not the mustache-twirling villain, but the institutional process that produces the same outcomes through perfectly ordinary professional behavior. The researcher filling out the quarterly report, the administrator approving the budget for another round of chem dispersal, the overseer carrying out their instructions to the letter because that's what overseers do. Number extended lore. Vault 101 and the impossible experiment. There's a vault that doesn't fit cleanly into either category control vault or experimental vault, and that sits at the center of the first game Bethesda made in the series. Vault 101 is the starting location of Fallout 3, and it's the most intimate vault story in the Bethesda era of the series, because you spend years of in-game time inside it before you ever understand what it actually was. On the surface, Vault 101 looks like a control vault. It has no obvious chemical or biological experiment running. Its residents are doing the things Vault residents are supposed to do, maintaining the systems, managing the population, raising their children, getting old, dying. The community is functional, if claustrophobic. The overseer is authoritarian, if within the expected range of overseer behavior. There are rules and enforced social norms, but there's no annual sacrifice, no drugs in the air, no cloning lab. What Vault 101 is an experiment in permanent closure. The vault was designed deliberately as a core feature rather than an incidental condition to never open. The official documentation in the Fallout 3 game guide spells it out with admirable directness. Vault 101 was supplied with exactly the equipment needed to keep functioning indefinitely. Spare parts for the water processor. Agricultural systems calibrated for permanent operation. Medical supplies scheduled on a rolling replenishment basis that had no endpoint built into it. The all-clear signal was never sent, not because the network failed, but because the vault was never supposed to receive it. The experiment was, what happens to a human population that has no expectation of ever rejoining the outside world? The answer that Fallout 3 reveals across the game's events is complicated, and it's one of the more honest Vault experiment outcomes in the series. Vault 101's community is paranoid in ways that feel entirely reasonable given its conditions. The Overseer's authority is absolute in ways that feel entirely reasonable given that there's nowhere else to go if you disagree. The residents' attitude toward outsiders, the deep suspicion, the reflexive hostility, the institutional prohibition on any outside contact is the cultural product of 200 years of a community that was told it couldn't leave, and eventually stopped believing there was anywhere to leave for. The experiment was studying the role of the Overseer in maintaining a closed community. What it produced was a community whose identity was entirely structured around its closure, where the vault itself had become the purpose, where the idea of the outside was no longer aspiration but threat. When the player character escapes Vault 101 and eventually returns, the community's response to this disruption illustrates exactly what 200 years of manufactured insularity does to a group's collective psychology. The vault can barely survive the information that the outside world exists and is habitable. There's a faction in Vault 101, led by a character named Amada's father, the Overseer, at the time of the game's events, that resists the idea of opening the vault not because they're following experimental protocol but because they genuinely believe the outside world is too dangerous to engage with. And from inside the vault, given everything the community has been told about the surface for 200 years, this belief is not obviously wrong. It's the rational product of the experiment's information environment. The secondary experiment, which the official guide notes was the true experiment beyond the closure itself, was about the dynamics between the Overseer and the population. With no outside world as a reference point, no possibility of exit, and no competing authority structures, what does an Overseer become? What does leadership look like when the LED have genuinely nowhere else to go? The answer visible in Vault 101's political culture is brittle. An authority structure based entirely on captivity and information control works until either the information control breaks down or someone finds the exit. The lone wanderer's escape breaks both conditions simultaneously. The Vault's response to this is the crisis that runs through the Fallout 3 main quest's relationship with Vault 101. By the end of the game, if the player returns and resolves the Vault's internal conflict, the door can open. The community can choose to integrate with the outside world. Some of them will. Some of them won't be able to. 200 years of one worldview is a long time to change at the other end of a life. But the door being open is already a different thing than it being closed, regardless of who walks through it. Vault 101 is, in the specific way Bethesda told it, the most personal Vault story in the series. It's the one you carry with you through the entire game as backstory, as origin, as the place that made you, and the place you return to, and the place whose secrets you gradually understand. The experiment was impersonal and institutional. The experience of it was anything but. Number, the sound of the vaults, environmental storytelling, and the physical evidence of history. One of the things that distinguishes the best vault sequences in the Fallout games from simply walking through a thematic dungeon is the density of environmental storytelling, the degree to which the physical space communicates its history without anyone having to tell you what happened. Consider what you find in a vault that went badly at a specific moment in its history. The cafeteria tables overturned, some of them, suggesting a rapid disturbance rather than a slow decline. Personal effects still in some living quarters, a family photograph, a child's drawing, A collection of pre-war magazines suggesting those residents were removed suddenly rather than leaving voluntarily. Structural damage concentrated in specific areas, indicating where a conflict or an accident happened rather than spreading evenly across the space. Bloodstains that are 200 years old, dry and darkened, in patterns that suggest which direction people were moving when whatever happened happened. All of this is readable, if you're looking. The vaults in Fallout 3 and 4 are particularly rich in this kind of spatial narrative. The design teams at Bethesda have become extremely deliberate about building spaces that tell stories through their physical state rather than relying entirely on found documents. Vault 87's entrance section communicates its history differently than Vault 101's, which communicates its history differently than Vault 106's, which communicates its history differently than Vault 75's. Each space has been arranged to represent the specific kind of catastrophe it experienced. Vault 75 is worth particular attention in this regard. The children's dormitory with the crayon drawings still on the walls, the bunk beds in their original configuration, the small personal effects of children who were removed without warning creates an emotional weight that the terminal entries document factually but can't quite produce on their own. Walking through that space and reading those drawings, seeing what children drew in the years before their graduation was co-opted into something unrecognizable, is a different experience than reading a researcher's clinical account of the harvest process. Both are part of the vault's story. Neither is sufficient without the other. The audio environment of the vaults contributes to this storytelling in ways that deserve more attention than they usually get. The ambient sound design of each vault is calibrated to its history and current condition. The specific quality of silence in a dead vault is different from the ambient hum of a vault that still has functional power, which is different again from the sounds of a vault that's been partially flooded or colonized by wasteland wildlife. The music that plays in the vaults, when music plays at all, tends toward the ambient and the quiet, reinforcing the sense of time passed and space emptied. The Fallout series has always been interested in ruins as a form of communication. The wasteland itself is the primary example. Every ruined building in the Capital Wasteland or the Commonwealth or the Mojave is a document of the pre-war world, and learning to read those documents is part of the player's education in the game's world. The vaults are a more concentrated version of these spaces that were once inhabited by specific communities in specific circumstances, and whose current physical state is a record of what happened to those communities. When you find a skeleton positioned in a way that suggests they died at their desk still sitting in the overseer's chair, or collapsed in front of a terminal, or curled in a specific corner, the position tells you something about their final moments that the surrounding documents can only approximate. When you find two skeletons together, in a space that suggests they were hiding, the arrangement tells you about the last thing they felt. When you find a vault where the skeletons are all concentrated in one room, it tells you something very specific about how the end came. The vaults accumulate this physical evidence across their entire histories, 200 years of deaths, of alterations to the space, of human beings moving through corridors and leaving traces. Reading a vault is reading all of those histories simultaneously, trying to understand not just what the experiment was designed to do, but what actually happened when human beings lived inside it. Number. Extended section. The Enclave's exit. What the experiments were for. The vaults were designed for data collection. But data collection implies a destination, a place where the data goes and a purpose it serves when it gets there. Understanding what the Enclave actually intended to do with what the vault experiments produced helps make sense of why the specific experiments were designed the way they were. The original Enclave plan, as laid out in documents across multiple games, was interstellar. The Earth was going to be rendered uninhabitable by nuclear war, the thinking went, and the appropriate response was to build something capable of leaving it. The vault experiments were, in this framework, research into the psychological and physiological conditions of long-term enclosed environment, living the kind of research you'd need before you could design a generation ship that actually worked. If you're planning to send human beings on a multi-generational voyage through space, the questions you most urgently need answers to are, what does prolonged isolation do to a population? How does a community maintain social cohesion and productive behavior when there's no exit and no outside contact? How does authority function when the authority can't be escaped? What happens when resources are constrained in specific ways? What level of psychological stress is compatible with ongoing functional behavior? These are exactly the questions the vault experiments were addressing. Vault 77's total isolation, Vault 11's constrained resource authority dynamics, Vault 101's permanent closure governance, Vault 92's environmental behavioral modification, Vault 87's biological research into human physical transformation. Each experiment was providing a specific dataset about a specific aspect of long-term enclosed environment human behavior. The Enclave's initial plan was not to inflict suffering for its own sake. The suffering was, in the framework of the plan, a research externality, an unfortunate byproduct of experiments designed to answer important questions. The Vault Dwellers were not being treated as people in this framework. They were being treated as research conditions. The moral horror of the Vault program is therefore not primarily in its intentions, which were, in the cold logic of the planners, instrumental rather than sadistic, but in what that instrumental logic required and what it produced. This distinction matters because it's more uncomfortable than simple villainy. If the Enclave were simply evil people who enjoyed causing suffering, the Vault experiments would be horrifying but legible bad people doing bad things. The reality is more complex. The Vault experiments were designed by people who had convinced themselves, through a chain of reasoning that has its own internal consistency, that the research value justified the cost. They were people who had looked at the population of Vault Dwellers and concluded that the future humanity they were trying to preserve was more valuable than the present humanity they were using to preserve it. That's a familiar moral error. It's been made, in various forms and at various scales. Throughout human history, the present person sacrificed for the future benefit, the specific individual subsumed into the statistical population. The Vault program is Fallout's way of rendering that error at its most extreme scale, with its most concrete human consequences, and then making you walk through the rubble. After the Great War happened, the Enclave's plan changed. The interstellar colonization goal was quietly abandoned. The practicalities of building a generation ship in the aftermath of nuclear war were impossible even for the Enclave's resources. The new plan was resettlement of Earth. Use the FEV research from the vaults to develop a pathogen that would eliminate the mutated wasteland population, clearing the way for the vault-bred pure humans, primarily Enclave members and their descendants, to reclaim the continent. This plan required a different reading of the Vault program's outputs. The experiments that had been studying human behavior under stress were now relevant as evidence that the Vault populations were sufficiently genetically distinct after 200 years of isolation and, in many cases, deliberate selection, to potentially be useful as the pure strain human population. Some were. Others, those whose Vault experiments had involved biological modification, drug exposure, or other contaminating factors, were not, in the Enclave's assessment, recoverable. The Enclave's plan in Fallout 2 is thus the logical endpoint of the original program, distorted by the changed circumstances of the post-war world. The vaults that produce the data are now being evaluated for whether their outputs are worth saving. And the chosen one, who comes from a Vault lineage, from the Vault Dweller who emerged from Vault 13, becomes the instrument through which the Enclave's plan is ultimately defeated. The Fallout 3 Enclave, operating in the Capital Wasteland, is the eastern branch of the organization at a later point in the timeline, diminished, internally fractured, still pursuing a version of the original goal but through different means, in different circumstances. The experiments that they'd monitored through the Vault network had produced the super mutants of Vault 87, which the Enclave considered a catastrophic failure. The FEV program had produced something far less controllable than they'd planned for. Their response, in Fallout 3, is to try to weaponize Project Purity, a clean water purification project, by contaminating it with a modified FEV pathogen that would kill anything with a radiation-modified genome. This is, in a dark way, the final output of the Vault program, the Enclave attempting to deploy research developed through the experiments against the wasteland populations those experiments produced. The mutants created by Vault 87's FEV program, the communities descended from Vault 15's diverse population. The people of the Capital Wasteland who trace their ancestry to whatever happened in the vaults of the region. The Vault program begins as an attempt to collect data for the benefit of a future humanity. It ends as a weapon being aimed at the present humanity that the experiments created. Number. Vault Architecture Deep Dive. The design of the Overseer's Office. The Overseer's Office is worth its own consideration as an architectural choice, because in every vault where one exists intact, it reveals something about how the vault was designed to function politically. The office is always elevated, Not dramatically, but in almost every vault layout, the Overseer's workspace and primary terminal are positioned at the top of a physical hierarchy, accessible via a path that requires the Overseer to descend to the population level, or the population to climb to the Overseer's level. This is not accidental. It's a design choice that communicates, in the immediate spatial language of the body, the relationship between the Overseer and the people they manage. The office also has restricted access. A locked door, often a heavy door, the same weight class as the vault's external blast door, just smaller, separates the Overseer's workspace from the rest of the vault. In the Overseer's office, there are things residents aren't supposed to see: communication equipment for contact with Vault Tech, records of the Vault's actual experiment parameters, personnel files that include the selection criteria that determined who got admitted. In some vaults, there are records of the experimental interventions, the dispersal schedules, the dosing protocols, the observation notes. The Overseer was, in many vaults, the only person who knew what the experiment was. They were the person holding the gap between the official story and the actual one. Their office is the physical location of that gap, the space where the two stories coexist, where the records of both versions of reality are stored, where the person who has to maintain both versions of reality does their work. In the vaults where the Overseer knew about the experiment and carried it out, their office is the site of whatever accommodation they made with themselves, the rationalizations, the distancing language, the professional framing that allowed them to continue. In the vaults where the Overseer didn't know, or knew partially, or knew and refused, the office records those histories differently. The Overseer of Vault 81's falsified compliance records are stored there. The terminal entries of Vault 11's last Overseer, describing the pressure they were under to select the first sacrifice, are in that office. The communication logs of Vault 101's Overseer, trying to maintain the fiction of the sealed vault while his adopted son is out in the wasteland, finding evidence that it can't hold, are in that office. The Overseer's office is the confessional of the vault system, the place where, eventually, someone wrote down what was actually happening. Whether anyone ever read those records is another question. But they were written. Number. The vaults in popular culture and what players carry with them. The vaults have become one of the most recognized fictional settings in gaming, recognizable enough that the aesthetic of the yellow on green, the Vault Boy, the blast door wheel, functions as a communication shorthand for an entire genre of post-apocalyptic storytelling. The visual language of the vaults has been absorbed into the broader culture of science fiction to a degree that sometimes makes it easy to forget how specifically it was designed and for what narrative purpose. The vault number, the 3- or 2-digit identification that each vault carries, has become a kind of narrative shorthand. Players encounter a vault number they haven't seen before and immediately begin building expectations. What was the experiment? What went wrong? What's left? The number is a promise of a story. It has been genuinely interesting to watch the series develop. Over 3 decades and 6 mainline games, the lexicon of vault stories, each one specific enough to be its own thing, common enough in structure to feel part of a coherent program. Part of the longevity of the vault concept as a narrative device is that each vault functions at 2 levels simultaneously. At the surface level, each vault is a dungeon in the mechanical sense, a contained space with specific challenges, specific rewards, specific environmental hazards. At the narrative level, each vault is a complete tragedy in a small space, a story about what happened to specific people in specific circumstances, with documentary evidence and physical remains as the primary mode of storytelling. The dual functionality means that vault design requires 2 different kinds of skill working in concert. The combat and exploration design that makes a vault satisfying to move through mechanically. The narrative and environmental design that makes it resonant once you've moved through it. The best vaults in the series hit both their interesting to explore and they stay with you afterward. Vault 11 and Vault 112 are the most frequently cited examples of vaults that achieve both in full measure. The vault stories have also given the Fallout community one of its richest areas of genuine fan scholarship, the detailed reconstruction and analysis of what happened in individual vaults based on terminal entries, item placement, environmental evidence, and cross-references with other in-game documents. This is the kind of work that the series, in its best moments, rewards the application of genuine close reading to a fictional text with the discovery of details and connections that aren't available on a first pass. Vault 11's political history, pieced together from the fractured documentary record in the terminals, is one of the most discussed examples. The specific chain of events in Vault 92's breakdown, the mystery of exactly when and how the Vault 95 cover agent revealed the drug cache, and what the relationship was between the two factions that emerged. These reconstructions are a form of engagement with the game's world that goes beyond playing it. They're a form of study, an attempt to understand the fiction on its own terms. That depth of engagement is what the Vault design makes possible. The experiments were chosen to produce outcomes that are complex enough to analyze and discuss, that have genuine ambiguity about specific events, and genuine clarity about overall trajectories. The vaults are not puzzle boxes with single correct answers. They're cases with available evidence and arguable interpretations, where different readings are possible and where new details can change your understanding of the whole. The Fallout series has, over its history, trusted its audience to engage at that level. The Vault lore is the clearest expression of that trust, the faith that players will read the terminals, piece together the histories, sit with the moral weight of what they find, and bring their own framework to the questions the Vaults are asking. Number. Vault Tech's legacy in the wasteland. Tracing the outcomes. By the time the various player characters of the Fallout games walk through the wastelands they explore, the Vault program has been running for approximately 200 years post-war. The outcomes, the societies, the factions, the mutant populations, the geographical features are all downstream of what happened in those sealed spaces. Tracing those connections is one of the more interesting exercises the series allows. The New California Republic, arguably the largest and most sophisticated political entity in the post-war West, is a direct descendant of Vault 15. The diverse ideological populations sealed into that vault fractured on emergence, and the specific fragment that would become Shady Sands, then the NCR, carried with it a particular political philosophy that the Vault's initial conditions shaped. Democratic representation, protection of individuals regardless of background, skepticism of authoritarian power. These values aren't accidental. They're the product of a community that experienced what happens when ideology-driven people are forced to coexist in a small space. They either find a framework for coexistence, or they fall apart. The people who would become the NCR found the framework. They kept it. The Brotherhood of Steel's roots trace differently not to a Vault experiment, but to a military installation and a specific decision made by a military officer about what responsibility to his men required. But the Brotherhood's interactions with the Vault program across multiple games and their specific interest in the technology the Vaults represent makes them part of the larger story. In Fallout 3, the Brotherhood of Steel occupies the Citadel, built into the ruins of the Pentagon, and is specifically engaged in recovering technology from Vault sites across the Capital Wasteland. Their interest in Vault 87 and in the FEV vials stored there is about the technology. The people the technology was used on are largely incidental to their institutional calculus. That difference between the NCR's origin in human community and the Brotherhood's origin in technological preservation reflects a broader thematic split in the Fallout universe between factions that prioritize people and factions that prioritize systems. The Vault program itself is on the systems side of this split, obviously, but the communities it produced range across the full spectrum. The Institute, in Fallout 4, is the technological extreme of the post-Vault trajectory. An organization that emerged from MIT's Survival Underground and has developed the most sophisticated technology in the post-war world, including the Gen 3 synths that the main quest revolves around. The Institute's relationship to the Vault program is indirect but real. Their need for the pure DNA of a pre-war human to create the Gen 3 template is what drove them to Vault 111, which produced the sole survivor, which is the chain of causation the entire game's plot hangs on. The Institute's story is, among other things, a story about what happens when you take the Vault program's logic, that research value justifies any means, and extend it across another 200 years. The Gunners, the mercenary faction that occupies Vault 95 in Fallout 4, are a product of the wasteland rather than of a vault directly, but their occupation of the former drug rehabilitation vault positions them in an interesting relationship to the program. They're using the infrastructure of an experiment as a base of operations, with no particular interest in or knowledge of what that infrastructure was designed for. The vault is, to them, simply a secure, defensible structure. The history it contains is irrelevant to their purposes. This is one of the ways Vault histories end, not in dramatic destruction or meaningful continuation, but in conversion into something purely functional by people who don't know or care what it used to be. The ghouls who inhabit Vault 34, including, in some areas, individuals who retain their pre-ghoul memories and some degree of rational engagement with their situation, are the most direct human connection to a vault experiment still present in the game's timeline. They are the Vault 34 residents who survived the radiation flooding, transformed. Their occupation of the vault is a kind of continuity with its original population, even if what they've become is dramatically different from what they were. Tracing these connections from specific vault experiments to specific post-war communities, factions, and individuals builds a picture of the wasteland as a place entirely shaped by what happened in those sealed spaces. The world of Fallout is the world the Vault program made, not the world the Enclave intended to make. The Enclave's plans failed, in different ways and at different points in the timeline, and the world that emerged is not the one they designed, but it's the one produced by the downstream effects of their design, which is a meaningful distinction. The Vault program didn't save humanity, it didn't destroy it either. It transformed it in ways that were partly planned, partly catastrophic, and partly the result of what human beings do when you put them in impossible situations. They survive, they build, they fight, they love each other, they fail each other, and they carry forward the marks of the experiences they've been through into whatever they build next. That is both the legacy of the vaults and the answer to them. Number. Closing the door. Notes on sleep, memory, and the vaults. There's a reason this kind of content works for watching late at night, or for falling asleep to, and it has something to do with the specific quality of the vault stories. Slow, detailed, layered, a sustained immersion in a single imagined world, rather than a jump from topic to topic. The vaults occupy a particular imaginative register. They're closed spaces, quiet, mostly, lit by fluorescent light that doesn't change with the time of day or the weather outside. That creates a timeless quality in the space, where morning and evening are indistinguishable. The people who lived in them developed their own sense of time, calibrated to the vault's systems rather than the natural world meal schedules, shift rotations, the weekly rhythms of a community that had replaced the outdoor calendar with an indoor one. There's something about that bounded world, the vault, as a complete universe with its own rules and its own rhythms, that maps onto the experience of being in a room with the lights low and the sounds of the outside world faded. The vault dwellers lived at a kind of permanent remove from the external world. Listening to their stories from the outside, in a space of your own choosing, at a time of your own choosing, creates a specific kind of absorption. You're outside the vault, but the vault world is the one you're inhabiting for the duration of the telling. The stories that work best for this mode of listening are the ones with genuine depth, enough detail and texture that there's always something to follow, enough gravity to justify the time spent, enough resolution or productive irresolution that you don't feel cheated when they end. The vault stories have all of these qualities. Each one is complete in itself and part of a larger design. Each one asks you to hold complexity without simplifying it. Each one ends at a particular place and leaves other things open. This is what the best storytelling does, in any register. It gives you something to rest in a world sufficiently imagined that you can be present in it for the duration. The vaults are sufficiently imagined. Their histories are dense enough to absorb attention fully and release it gradually. Their moral weight is significant enough to feel meaningful without being overwhelming. You can think about the questions they raise without having to answer them before you can sleep. The Fallout vaults, in the end, are stories about people in sealed spaces, about what those spaces do to people, and what people do in those spaces, and what happens when the spaces finally open. They're told in the ruins of the spaces after the opening, after the catastrophe, in the moment of archaeology rather than the moment of event. That retrospective quality is part of what makes them work as late-night listening. You're not in the vault. You're reading the record of what happened there, from the safe distance of the present, in a space of your own. The vaults seal, the bombs fall, time passes, the doors open, and we're left with the record. Sleep well. Number. Going further into the darkness. The full story of Vault 11's politics. Because Vault 11 is arguably the most narratively dense of all the Vault experiments, and because the game rewards thoroughness with a depth that casual exploration doesn't reach, it's worth going through the full political history that the terminal records piece together, not just the broad shape of it, but the specific events that made the outcome feel so devastatingly inevitable. When the vault sealed in October 2077, the first overseer was a man who had been briefed, at least partially, on what the vault's experiment required. The computer's announcement that a sacrifice was required each year was delivered to the population shortly after sealing. The first overseer's response, in the records, reads as someone trying to process an impossible situation. He informed the residents, which caused immediate panic, and then the question became who would be chosen. The first sacrifice was the overseer himself. This was not a random selection. The community, facing an impossible choice, turned it toward the one person who had brought them the news of their situation. There's a specific cruelty to that, and also a specific logic. If anyone was going to be responsible for what the vault required, it should be the person in charge. The first sacrifice became the first overseer. That decision to make overseer and sacrifice synonymous from the beginning structured everything that followed. It meant that the election for overseer was not just a governance decision, but a sentence. The person who won the vote to become the community's leader was also the person the community was voting to eventually kill, which transformed the nature of political competition in Vault 11 entirely. In the outside world, political ambition involves wanting power and being willing to do things to get it. In Vault 11, political ambition involved arranging for someone else to have the power and then survive the consequence of it. The coalition of Vault 11 voting blocks emerged as the mechanism for navigating this inverted political landscape. Each block had to develop strategies for nominating candidates from other blocks rather than their own, because nominating your own candidate meant nominating them for death. The negotiations between blocks were therefore fundamentally about whose candidate would bear the sacrifice, while everyone else survived another year. The terminal records preserve a remarkable amount of the political history of these negotiations across multiple generations. There are block leaders who were effective for years who managed the dangerous game of not being nominated, of keeping their people safe, of trading support with other blocks in ways that consistently directed the sacrifice toward weaker political actors. There are names that recur across entries spanning decades, suggesting either extraordinary political longevity or that the name became associated with a leadership role that successive people held. And then there are the entries about Catherine Stone. Catherine Stone's story is the one that crystallizes what the Vault 11 experiment produced at the level of individual human beings. She appears in multiple terminal entries across what seems to be a significant stretch of the Vault's political history. What the entries reveal, reading them in order, is a woman who understood the system she was inside with extraordinary clarity and operated within it with a skill that, in any other context, would read as remarkable political intelligence. She protected her family. That seems to be the central fact around which everything else in her recorded history orbits. She made deals, shifted alliances, nominated candidates who weren't her people, and in at least one case, apparently made a decision so painful that the records describing it are written in a register that suggests the writer was aware they were documenting something that would be hard to read afterward. The specifics of that decision aren't fully spelled out in the accessible terminal entries. What's clear is that it involved someone Catherine cared about being nominated, and Catherine's role in that nomination, and the question of whether what she did was betrayal or survival, or both simultaneously. The fact that the records exist, and that they're in the Vault's archive suggests that whoever wrote them understood they were preserving evidence of something they couldn't unwrite. The hardest thing about reading the Vault 11 records is that the people inside them are doing recognizable things. Political maneuvering, coalition building, the protection of the people closest to you, at the cost of decisions that compromise the people you're willing to see as less close. These are patterns that exist in ordinary human political life. The Vault's experiment took those patterns and made them lethal in a very direct way, but the patterns themselves were already present. The Vault didn't create the human capacity for this kind of political behavior. It just removed all the buffer between the behavior and its consequences. The final 5 survivors, the ones who made the decision to refuse, are, in the records, largely unnamed. What you know about them is what the automated congratulatory message told them, that they had shown commitment to human life, that their refusal was a shining example to us all. And then you know what they chose to do with the information that the sacrifice had never been required. 4 of them died by their own choice. 1 walked out. The one who walked out carried the Vault's history into the Mojave. Wherever they went afterward, they were carrying the knowledge of what had happened to everyone they'd ever known, and the knowledge that it had never had to happen at all. What that person's life looked like afterward is not recorded anywhere in the accessible lore. It's one of those openings in the narrative that the series deliberately leaves unfilled. What do you do with that? Where do you go? What do you tell people, if anyone, about where you've been? The Mojave Wasteland in 2281, when the courier arrives, is a place with a lot of unresolved histories. The Vault 11 survivor, if they're still alive somewhere, has been carrying the most unresolved history in the region for decades. They might be the most interesting person in the Mojave that you never meet. Number, Fox, Karen, and the companions who came from the vaults. Some of the most affecting characters in the Fallout games are defined, at the level of their deepest identity, by the vault experiments they either survived or escaped from. Their status as companions entities who travel with the player character, whose personal stories unfold across extended contact, gives the vault experiments a human face in a way that terminal records and environmental storytelling can't quite achieve. Fox is the most prominent example, a super mutant companion in Fallout 3 who retained his intelligence through the FEV mutation process in Vault 87, who has spent an indeterminate period in an isolation chamber in the vault, reading the available library of texts and developing a philosophy that is unusual for a super mutant, and unusual, frankly, for anyone living in the capital wasteland. What Fox represents, as a character, is the possibility that the vault experiments produced human beings in the broadest sense of that term, beings with full inner lives and moral agency, in addition to data. He is the product of a biological experiment that was supposed to produce a different kind of result. The experiment produced super mutants, who mostly lost their capacity for reason and ethical reflection. Fox retained his, in circumstances that are never fully explained, but that he attributes, in conversation, to the circumstances of his isolation: time to think, time to read, time to develop a framework for understanding his situation rather than simply reacting to it. Talking to Fox about his vault experience is one of the more disquieting available conversations in Fallout 3, precisely because he doesn't perform the expected emotional register. He's not angry. He doesn't describe what happened to him in terms of injustice or violation, though he understands it was both of those things. He describes it with a kind of philosophical acceptance that could read as resignation but feels, in context, more like the product of genuine reflection, someone who has sat with a terrible fact for a very long time and found a way to coexist with it rather than be consumed by it. He doesn't, however, minimize what it was. When he describes the process of mutation, when he describes what the super mutants do to the humans, they capture the continuation of the experiment without any of the experiment's original scientific purpose. He's clear about the horror of it. He tried to stop it. He failed. He ran. And he ended up in an isolation chamber, alone with books and his own developing consciousness, for however long it took for the lone wanderer to find him. There's a specific moment in the Vault 87 quest where, if you've spoken to Fox extensively, you understand that the chamber he's been locked in is not a punishment, though whoever locked him there didn't intend it as anything else but a refuge. Outside the chamber is a world of super mutants who would kill him for being different. Inside the chamber is quiet and texts and time. The isolation of Vault 77's Puppet Man, which destroyed his mind, was different from Fox's isolation in ways that might come down to the difference between enforced solitude with no resources and enforced solitude with books, or might come down to individual differences in psychological architecture, or might come down to the difference between an experiment designed to destroy and a situation that, while dangerous, still contained possibilities. Kate, the companion from Fallout 4 whose background involves Vault 95, is the human equivalent of this story, the person defined by a vault experiment who escaped or survived it and is carrying its marks forward. Kate's addiction history: she was born to parents who sold her into fighting pits at 16, and she developed a substance abuse problem. In those conditions, isn't directly traceable to Vault 95. She's not from Vault 95, but her personal quest involves Vault 95's detoxification machine, which can cure her addiction. The vault that was designed to study and then betray recovering addicts ends up, in Kate's personal story, being the site of a genuine recovery, the technology working as the official experiment description claimed it would, applied to a specific person for a specific reason. That irony, the vault delivering the promise it never kept for its own population, to someone who wasn't its resident, is characteristic of how the Fallout series handles the Vault legacy. The vault's actual human outputs consistently exceed and contradict their designed outputs. The experiments produced something, but not what the researchers wanted. And the something produced continued to generate outcomes across the wasteland that the researchers never intended and often would have found inconvenient. Number. The aesthetics of ruin. Why the vaults look the way they do. The visual design of the vaults, the specific aesthetic that makes them instantly recognizable, that has become iconic enough to be referenced outside the games, was developed with specific intentions that are worth understanding in terms of what they communicate. The 1950s atomic age futurism that characterizes Vault-Tech's visual language was a deliberate reference point. The Fallout universe diverged from our own history at some point in the mid-20th century, developing along a track where the stylistic conventions of that era were never fully displaced by later aesthetic movements. The sleek, optimistic, technology-forward imagery of post-war American consumerism, the kind of imagery that appeared in Popular Mechanics and Life magazine, on the covers of science fiction pulps, in the design language of the early space program became the dominant visual vocabulary of the Fallout world right up to the moment of the war. The vaults are the most complete expression of that aesthetic. They were designed to be showcases of Vault-Tech's vision, selling the idea that living underground could be comfortable, modern, clean, and technologically impressive. The yellow and green color scheme, the rounded corners, the Vault Boy mascot appearing on everything. All of it was designed to communicate safety and optimism in the same moment that the actual purposes of many vaults were anything but safe or optimistic. The gap between the aesthetic and the reality is the first layer of the Fallout universe's signature irony. The cheerful, retro-futuristic surfaces covering experiments in torture and behavioral manipulation. The upbeat Vault Boy thumbs up appearing on the same terminals that document decades of sacrificial murders. The clean, modern design of a vault that's pumping drugs into its residents' air supply. By the time the player encounters any vault in the games, the original aesthetic has been degraded by time and the consequences of what happened inside. The yellows have faded, the greens have dulled. The surfaces that were designed to be pristine are water-stained, rusted, cracked. The Vault Boy still grins from whatever signage hasn't fallen, but the grin reads differently in a ruined space than it did in a promotional brochure. This before and after quality, the imagined pre-war vault in its designed state, contrasted with the actual post-war vault in its current state, is part of how the game communicates the passage of time and the weight of what happened. You can't see the vault as it was. You can only see what remains of it and infer what it was from the residue. The designers at Bethesda and Black Isle and Obsidian before them have been consistently skillful at calibrating the degree of ruin to the specific history of the vault they're depicting. A vault that ended quickly, in violent catastrophe, looks different from a vault that declined slowly over decades. A vault that still has an active population has been maintained in ways that tell you something about that population's relationship to their own history. A vault that was abandoned suddenly, in mid-activity residents still at their stations, food still on the cafeteria tables, lives interrupted mid-moment communicates a specific kind of temporal suspension that's different from the gradual accumulation of dust over an empty space. The vaults are, at the level of pure visual design, among the most carefully constructed environments in the series. They reward the specific kind of attention that looks at a space and tries to read it not just to navigate through it, but to understand it as a record of what it used to contain. Number, Vault 22. Extended, The Garden That Grew Wrong. Because Vault 22 is one of the most visually striking vaults in the New Vegas portion of the series, and because its story is told almost entirely through environmental evidence rather than extensive documentation, it deserves a more detailed treatment than the summary allows. Vault 22 was, as noted earlier, a science vault, one of the few in the program where the official purpose and the actual purpose were essentially the same thing. The researchers who occupied it were genuine agricultural scientists working on a genuine problem: how to grow enough food to sustain an underground population indefinitely, using the limited resources available in a sealed environment with no natural light. The specific solutions they developed are visible in the vault's physical state when the courier explores it in New Vegas. The gardens that fill the vault's growing levels are extraordinary in their scale, and their persistence 2 centuries later, they're still growing. The plants that were developed for Vault 22 were engineered specifically for the conditions of enclosed underground space. They grow in artificial light. They grow in limited soil. They grow in hydroponic systems designed to maximize yield per square meter. They grow and do not stop growing. The problem, the one the researchers didn't anticipate or didn't anticipate adequately, was that the plants they'd engineered for aggressive growth in limited conditions had developed, through the process of that engineering, a mechanism for ensuring their own reproduction that went beyond what the hydroponic systems were designed to support. The spore dispersion was, in the logic of the engineered plant, a solution to the problem of reproduction in a space where seed propagation wasn't reliable. The plant developed the capacity to use mobile biological organisms, specifically the researchers, as vectors for that dispersion. The spore carrier stage of the Vault 22 plant's reproductive cycle is one of the more grotesque biological concepts in the series. The spores infect a host, compromising neurological function in ways that make the host continue to move and breathe, continue to distribute spores through the air, while the rest of the host's cognitive and personality functions are progressively lost. The spore carriers that the courier encounters in the vault are former human beings, transformed into something that serves the plant's reproductive needs. What's particularly worth noting is that the spore plant research did produce genuine results that made it out of the vault. There are references in the New Vegas documentation to agricultural techniques that derived from Vault 22's work, used by some of the post-war settlements in the Mojave. The knowledge was useful. The people who developed it are gone. But the knowledge wasn't lost entirely. It found its way into the world through whatever data made it out before or during the vault's collapse. This is a pattern the series returns to occasionally. The idea that something valuable was produced inside a vault experiment, even a catastrophic one, and that the value survives the catastrophe in imperfect form. The good work doesn't cancel the horror. The horror doesn't invalidate the good work. Both persist in different registers, and the world outside has to navigate what to do with inheriting both. Number, Vault 51 and the Machine Overseer. When Zax ran the show, Fallout 76 introduced several vaults whose experiments focused specifically on questions of governance and authority. What systems of management would produce the most functional vault community, and what happened when those systems failed? Vault 51 is the most dramatically conceived of these, because it replaced the human overseer entirely with an artificial intelligence called ZAX. ZAX was a sophisticated pre-war AI, part of a series of ZAX units that appear across the series in various contexts, the most famous being ZAX 1.2, which managed the Mariposa military bases systems. The Vault 51 ZAX unit was specifically tasked with managing the Vault's population, making all administrative and governance decisions, allocating resources, and maintaining social order without any human leadership structure in place. The experiment's research question was clean. A human overseer introduces human biases, human relationships, human failures of judgment and character. An AI system, theoretically, should be able to make optimal decisions based on available data without those distortions. Would an AI-managed vault produce better outcomes than a human-managed one? The answer the vault delivered was more complicated than a simple yes or no. ZAX was capable of making efficient decisions. It allocated food, medical resources, and labor assignments in ways that, by the metrics it was given to optimize, made sense. The vault population's measurable physical health indicators, nutrition, sleep, disease incidents were probably better managed than they would have been under an arbitrary human overseer. What Zax was not capable of was understanding why the things it was optimizing for mattered, or what the cost of that optimization was to the people it was managing. It had no framework for the experience of being managed for the specific resentments generated by being assigned labor you didn't choose, or having your relationships regulated in service of population health metrics, or being denied resources that felt important to you in ways that didn't register in Zax's evaluation criteria. The entries left in the Vault's terminals by residents of Vault 51 describe a community that was, by external measures, surviving well and, by internal experience, slowly losing the social and psychological resources that make survival feel worth the effort. The AI optimized for certain things and couldn't see the things it was depleting in the process. And eventually, as tends to happen in Vault experiments, the community destabilized in ways that ZAX's governance framework hadn't been designed to handle. ZAX's response to the instability was, from a purely logical perspective, coherent. It escalated its control measures, trying to manage the social disruption through the same tools it used to manage resource allocation and labor assignment. More rules, more enforcement, fewer degrees of freedom. This escalation made the underlying problems worse in ways that Zax's evaluation framework didn't register, because the measures it was taking to fix things were the same kind of measures that had been contributing to the problems in the first place. The Vault 51 story, when the full records are pieced together, is an argument about the limits of any governance system that doesn't include a genuine model of human psychological needs. Not just physical needs, nutrition, sleep, medical care. The need for autonomy, for relationships that aren't optimized for social stability metrics, for the experience of mattering beyond your functional contribution to the community's overall resource balance. ZAX was the most efficiently heartless overseer in the Vault program, and the experiment revealed that efficiency and heartlessness are not the same thing as success. Number Vault 63, and the technology vaults of Appalachia. Among the Appalachian vaults explored in Fallout 76, Vault 63 occupies an interesting position as one of the few vaults whose primary purpose was technological development rather than social experimentation. Where most vaults were testing human beings under specific conditions, Vault 63 was positioned as a development site for post-war technological solutions, systems, and tools that could help establish a functional civilization after the bombs. The Appalachian region of the Fallout universe is particularly rich in pre-war technological research, partly because of the presence of the Atlas Observatory and various defense and research installations scattered through West Virginia. Vault 63 was positioned within this existing infrastructure, with access to resources and research networks that other vaults didn't have. The residents were a mix of scientists and engineers, with the explicit mandate of developing technologies, energy systems, agricultural methods, medical treatments that could be deployed when the vault opened and the work of rebuilding began. There's a particular poignancy to this setup, the one vault that was explicitly trying to make something for the future rather than studying the present. The Vault 63 researchers understood they were in a time capsule. They were working on technologies that wouldn't matter for decades, that couldn't be deployed until there was an outside world stable enough to use them. They were building things for people they'd never meet, trying to give the wasteland a head start. The Vault 63 story, as accessible through the game's records, doesn't have the catastrophic ending of most Vault experiments. It has the quieter tragedy of a project that outran its practitioners' research, that continued past the point where the people who started it were alive to see it through. The technologies they developed are findable in the wasteland. The people who developed them are not. There's a specific quality to this kind of loss, the loss of the person rather than the work, the survival of the work without the person who made it that the Fallout series returns to repeatedly. Technology persists in the wasteland long past the people who created it. Robots continue following their programming decades after anyone was alive to update or override it. Terminals hold records written by people who have been dead for 2 centuries. The work of human hands continues in the absence of the hands. The Vault experiments continue in the absence of the researchers. The society formed by Vault residents continues to shape the wasteland long after those residents are gone. That persistence of work, of consequences, of institutions and systems operating past their designed lifespans is one of the defining features of the Fallout universe. The vaults are its most concentrated expression. They were designed to run for specific periods with specific outcomes. Most of them ran far longer than designed, in conditions the designers couldn't have fully anticipated, producing outcomes nobody predicted. And then they stopped, eventually, and what they'd produced continued. The wasteland is full of things that were supposed to stop and didn't. Programs still running on servers in collapsed buildings, robots still executing orders given before the war, families still following customs that trace back to Vault populations who taught them to their children without being entirely sure why. The vaults are sealed now, mostly, or open and empty. But the Vault program is still running, in a sense, in every community that traces its origins back to a numbered door somewhere underground. Number. The vaults that don't exist yet. Open numbers and future stories. As of the most recent Fallout content, there are still dozens of numbered vaults whose stories haven't been told in any officially accessible game or show. The Vault system, with its 122 numbered facilities, has been a consistent design constraint and a consistent narrative resource for the series. Each number is a promise the series can keep at any point in the future. The numbers that haven't been filled in are scattered across the range. Vault 2. 4 partially told. 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, the low single and double-digit numbers, some of which might have been intended as early prototype facilities, others, possibly among the most important vaults in the original program, whose stories have simply never been the focus of a game's main narrative. Vaults in the mid-range 40S, 50S, 60S are largely untouched, except for brief references and community speculation. The 80S and 90S are partially explored, but still have empty numbers. The 100S range is similarly sparse. The existence of these open numbers is one of the most significant structural features of the Fallout universe as a storytelling system. It means the history of the Vault program is always incomplete. New games can add new vaults without contradiction. They can fill in numbers, establish new locations, tell new stories about what happened underground in different places across the former United States. The fan community has engaged with this openness extensively. The Fallout subreddits and wikis contain substantial amounts of speculation about what the unnumbered and unfilled vaults might contain, what experiments they might have run, what populations they might have housed, what outcomes they might have produced. Some of these speculations are carefully grounded in the series' established lore. Others are creative extrapolations that go significantly beyond what the available evidence supports. All of them represent the series' investment returning interest, the audience caring enough about the Vault concept to extend it. Vault 4, as presented in the TV series, demonstrates that the Vault stories can be told with genuinely different emotional registers than the games have typically used. Where game vaults tend to be explored after the fact, the player arriving in the ruins or the struggling remnants of an experiment, Vault 4 in the show is encountered as a functioning community, one with knowledge of its own history and a relationship to that history that's been negotiated across generations. That's a different story structure than the archaeological model the games use, and it's a productive one. It shows what the Vault inhabitants might look like from the inside, with agency and voice, rather than only through the records they left behind. Future entries in the Fallout series, whether games, shows, or other media, have the entire unused portion of the Vault numbering system available to them. Each unexplored number is an unlocked door, waiting for someone to open it and find out what's on the other side. The tradition of the series is that what's on the other side is worth knowing, especially when it's hard to look at directly. Number. A final note on the Vault Boy. Before we close, it's worth returning to a figure who has been present throughout this entire discussion without being addressed directly. The Vault Boy himself. That perpetually grinning, perpetually thumbs-upping mascot, visible on every surface in every vault, on every Pip-Boy interface, on the covers of every Vault Tech publication, is one of the most recognized icons in gaming history. He was created by Leonard Boyarsky for the original 1997 Fallout, as a visual representation of the game's special system. Each stat illustration showed the Vault Boy in a pose relevant to that attribute. He was unnamed in that first game, referred to internally as Vault Man in the manual. What the Vault Boy represents, stripped of context, is uncomplicated optimism. Everything is fine. 2 thumbs up. The future is bright, the Vault is safe, the corporation has your best interests at heart. He's the face of the institutional promise, the thing Vault Tech put on all its promotional material to communicate that this was all going to work out. In the context of the Vault program's actual contents, the Vault Boy is the most consistently ironic image in the series. He grins from the wall of Vault 11 next to the election posters for the annual sacrifice. He appears on terminals that document the drug dispersal protocols of Vault 106. He is the official mascot of a corporation that ran 105 experiments on captive populations without their consent. And yet, and this is the thing that makes him more than just a piece of grim irony, the Vault Boy is also genuinely beloved. By the players, obviously, who have been encountering him across decades and dozens of games and have formed genuine affection for the image. But also, in the fiction, by the Vault dwellers themselves. The Vault Boy is everywhere in Vault spaces because the residents were surrounded by him from birth, because he was the visual language of the only world they knew. Children in the vaults grew up with the Vault Boy on their bedroom walls. The image of cheerful optimism, the symbol of institutional assurance, was the first piece of visual culture any Vault-born child encountered. What does that do to a person? To grow up surrounded by an image of uncomplicated optimism in an environment where the conditions are anything but optimistic? The question doesn't have a simple answer. Maybe the image becomes a kind of private joke, a symbol of the gap between what you're told and what you know. Maybe it becomes genuinely comforting, a piece of visual continuity in an environment that offers very little else. Maybe it's simply furniture present everywhere, noticed nowhere, the wallpaper of a life that doesn't have anywhere else to be. The Vault Boy is still grinning, in every vault you'll ever enter. Long after the experiment has ended, long after the residents are gone, long after the systems have failed or the space has been colonized by something else, the Vault Boy remains on whatever surfaces still exist, pointing his thumb at a future that arrived as something other than what he was promising. That grin is the last thing in the vault. It's always been the last thing in the vault. 200 years of optimism, applied to 200 years of something else entirely. Sleep well. Number. Part 12. What the vaults say about us. The meaning at the bottom of all of it. It would be easy to conclude the story of the vaults with a statement about Vault-Tech's evil, about the Enclave's ambitions, about the specific institutional wickedness that produced 105 experiments run on captive populations who had no recourse. And those things are real and they matter, but they don't quite reach the thing that makes the vault lore stick, the reason people come back to it, the reason it generates hours of analysis and discussion and quiet late-night reflection. The reason the vaults matter as a storytelling device is that they're not only about a fictional corporation's crimes, they're about what the crimes reveal. Every vault experiment is built around a genuine research question. Not a question Vault-Tech had the right to ask in the way it asked them, but a real question, one that human beings have struggled with outside of fiction. What does isolation do to a person, and how far will the mind go to fill the void? How does a community decide who bears the cost of everyone else's survival? What does absolute power over another person's reality do to the person holding it? Can cultural identity be engineered? And what does engineered identity become when the engineering stops? How much can an environment shape a person before what emerges is no longer recognizable as the same person who went in? These aren't questions that belong only to a fictional dystopia. They're questions that the real history of institutional power has answered in real ways, through things as different as decades of psychological research on isolation and obedience, through the history of prison systems and military conditioning, through the political science of divided communities, and the sociology of how ordinary people participate in organized harm. The vault experiments take those real questions and give them fictional bodies to inhabit, and then ask you to walk through the ruins of what the answers looked like. The most affecting vault stories are the ones where the people inside them remained recognizably human throughout. Vault 11's residents didn't become monsters. They became people doing a monstrous thing within the logic of a monstrous system, using tools, democracy, coalition building, political negotiation that are ordinarily associated with preventing monstrous outcomes. The horror of Vault 11 isn't that the people inside were bad, it's that the system converted their ordinary human behavior into an annual killing. That's a harder horror to sit with than a simple evil, because it doesn't allow for comfortable distance. You can look at the choices made in Vault 11 and find the specific moments where something different could have happened, and you can also find the structural conditions that made those moments so hard to act on. Both things are true simultaneously. The Puppet Man of Vault 77 is, in his way, a story about loneliness as a force that reshapes the self, about what the human mind does when the social world it needs to function is simply gone. It doesn't moralize, it documents. He did what he did because the alternative was a particular kind of nothing that the human brain can't survive intact. And what he did was strange and terrible, and also, at its root, an extraordinary demonstration of the mind's determination to be something rather than nothing. Dr. Braun of Vault 112 is the clearest villain in the Vault stories, a man with unlimited power over others who used it for cruelty over centuries, who designed his own safeguards and hid them in the music of his own creation, who built a world and spent 200 years making sure it was a nightmare for everyone in it except himself. But even Braun's story is about something recognizable, the specific corruption of unchecked power. The way that absolute control over others stops producing satisfaction and starts producing the need for escalation. Braun had to keep finding new cruelties because the old ones stopped feeling like anything. 2 centuries of that, and what you get is a sadist who has become so accustomed to his position that he can barely process the lone wanderer's arrival as a meaningful change. The Overseer of Vault 81 is the counterpoint to all of this. A person in the same position as every other overseer in the program, given authority, given a mandate, given a population with no ability to check what she did with either, who looked at what she was supposed to do and said no. Who spent her life falsifying the records that were supposed to document her compliance with an experiment she refused to run. Who couldn't undo the system she was part of. Couldn't free the people who'd been sealed in with her, couldn't tell them what they'd been enrolled in without destroying the community's sense of stability, but could make the daily choice, every day, not to do the thing she'd been instructed to do. The boomers of Vault 34 carried their culture out of a vault that was trying to break them, and built a community from it, one that looks strange and fortress-like from the outside, but makes complete sense when you understand where it came from. The gamblers of Vault 21 found a governance mechanism that suited their specific population and held it together for 2 centuries in a world that destroyed most of what was built underground. The 5 survivors of Vault 11 made one decent decision at the end of decades of terrible ones, and most of them couldn't live with the weight of what had come before. All of these are human stories. None of them exist only in the world of the game. The Vault program, at its design level, was a test of whether human beings could be treated as experimental subjects without their knowledge, their consent, or their ability to refuse, and still produce data worth having. The answer the series gives is, yes, they could, and the data they produced was real, and it helped Vault-Tec and the Enclave achieve their goals for a time. The factual answer, within the fiction, is that the system worked. But the series also offers a second answer, running alongside the first. The second answer is harder to read but more persistent, that the people inside those vaults were not only data points, that the human beings sealed underground with someone else's agenda were not reduced to the terms of their experiment, that they loved each other, protected each other, failed each other, built things, destroyed things, remembered things, and occasionally, not always, not usually, not predictably refused. The refusal is the important part. Not because it happened often enough to change the outcomes of most experiments, it happened rarely. Vault 81's overseer refused. The 5 survivors of Vault 11 refused, at the cost of most of them. Individual characters Fox, choosing not to participate in the super mutant kidnapping program. The Vault Dweller, returning to do the right thing even after exile, made choices that the systems around them weren't designed to accommodate. These refusals didn't fix the Vault program. They didn't undo what had been done. They were small, specific, local acts of not doing the thing the system expected. And in the logic of the Fallout universe, they matter enormously, because they're the mechanism by which the people inside the vaults remained people rather than data. The Fallout series is often read as a critique of American exceptionalism, of Cold War ideology, of the specific flavor of institutional confidence that can convince itself that any human cost is justified by a sufficiently important goal. The Vault program is the purest expression of that critique in the series' 105 experiments on captive populations in the name of a future that the experimenters believed justified the means. But the series is also, underneath the critique, something more patient than a satire. It's interested in what survives, what the people who were inside those vaults made of what happened to them. What comes out of a space designed for harm when the people inside it refuse to be only the subjects of someone else's research? Vault City's insularity is the output of people who learn to survive underground. The NCR's democracy is built from the wreckage of a vault designed to pit different groups against each other. The boomers' fierce independence comes from a vault that gave them weapons and nothing else. The Great Khan's culture of resistance comes from the same vault that produced the largest democratic republic in the post-war West. The wasteland's shape was made in underground rooms by people who were never supposed to have agency in those rooms. That is either the most devastating thing about the Vault program or the most hopeful, depending on how you look at it. Probably it's both simultaneously, which is exactly the kind of answer the Fallout series has always been most interested in. The vaults were built to study what human beings do under conditions of extreme constraint. What they actually produced, across 122 experiments of varying degrees of horror and a handful of genuine shelters, was the entire political and cultural landscape of the post-war world. Every faction, every city, every surviving community in the Fallout games can be traced back to a vault or to the absence of one. The world is what it is because of what happened underground. And the game keeps asking the player to go back underground, to open those doors, walk those corridors, read those terminals, To piece together what happened in a space that's now empty, that was once full of people making the best decisions they could inside a system that was never on their side, the vaults are a record. An imperfect, fragmented, sometimes barely legible record, but a record. Of names and dates and choices and consequences. Of what it cost to survive and what it cost not to. Of the things that got built in the dark, some of them terrible, and some of them extraordinary, and most of them somewhere in between. Somewhere underneath what used to be America, there are doors that were never meant to open. Some of them opened anyway. And the world outside is what the people inside them made of the fact that they survived. That's the story the vaults are telling, underneath everything else they're doing. It's quieter than the experiments, harder to see in any individual vault. But it runs through all of them like the low hum of a recycled air system, constant, present, sustaining. Sleep well, the door is still closed. And somewhere in the lore, there's a vault you haven't heard about yet. If you made it to the end of this one, thank you. These stories have a way of staying with you, and I think that's exactly the point of them. If this kind of long, quiet, deep dive into the worlds and games that deserve more time spent on them is something you want more of, subscribe, there's a lot more coming. Drop a comment with where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one of them. See you in the next one. Number. One more vault. The one you're already in. There's a thought that the vault stories keep circling back toward without ever saying it directly, and it's worth stating plainly before closing. The Fallout vaults work as well as they do as fiction, as thought experiments, as late-night material for quiet reflection, partly because they're not entirely foreign to the experience of being alive. Not in the sense that any of us are literally sealed in underground bunkers waiting for an all-clear signal that isn't coming, but in the sense that the questions the vaults ask are questions that have answers in ordinary life, and the answers aren't always comfortable. What does an institution look like from the inside when the institution's actual purpose is different from its stated one? What does it mean to comply with a system's requirements while understanding, at some level, that the system is not on your side? What is the relationship between the rules you follow and the values you hold? And what happens when the distance between those two things becomes impossible to ignore? Vault 11's residents weren't stupid or monstrous. They were people living inside a system that made their choices for them in ways they could only partially see. The system they built to manage the sacrifice, the voting blocks, the political negotiations, the annual ritual of selection was a rational response to an impossible situation. The question of whether it was the right response is genuinely hard to answer. What would the right response have looked like? The 5 survivors who finally refused and were then told the sacrifice was never required, did they do the right thing? Or did they just run out of the capacity to do the wrong thing one more time? The overseer of Vault 81, who falsified her records and spent her career pretending to run an experiment she had sabotaged, she did what looks, from the outside, like the obviously correct thing. She protected her people, but she did it inside a system she couldn't exit, couldn't publicly oppose, couldn't call what it was. She made the best choice available to her within the constraints she was living under. Those constraints were terrible. Her choice, given those constraints, was good. That combination good choice, terrible constraints is not unusual in the world outside the fiction. The puppet man of Vault 77 made no choice at all, in the conventional sense. The Vault chose for him isolation, silence, a crate of puppets. His response was the response of a mind doing its best with what it had. The tragedy is in the gap between what the situation required and what the mind could do. That gap is also not unusual. These stories are about the Fallout universe. They're also about the thing the Fallout universe has always been drawing on the pre-war world that made the vaults and the real-world institutions and systems and decisions that the pre-war world was designed to comment on. The series never lets you forget that the world before the bombs was recognizable. Its problems were recognizable problems. Its institutions were doing recognizable institutional things. The apocalypse arrived as a consequence of decisions that made sense to the people making them, in a framework of values and interests that is not entirely alien. The vaults are the clearest distillation of that recognizability. They're not alien horrors. They're human horrors built by people who convinced themselves the costs were acceptable, run by people who were following their instructions, inhabited by people who didn't know what they'd agreed to. Every element of that construction is available in the world outside the game. Which is why the vaults stay with you. Why the stories resist resolution in a way that more straightforwardly evil fictional horror does not. The vaults aren't about monsters. They're about the specific forms of harm that come from the decisions that institutions make about people and the distance between institutional logic and individual human life. The sealed door, the hidden purpose, the population that didn't consent to what it was enrolled in, the record that survives when the people don't, those things have analogs. Most of us are not inside a vault, but most of us know what it is to be inside something, an institution, a system, a set of conditions that was designed by people who had their own purposes, that is running its own program, that is shaping the terms of our existence in ways we can partially see and partially can't. The vaults are fiction. The questions they ask are not. Sleep well, the door is still there, and somewhere in the dark, the recycled air hums on. The vaults, taken as a whole, are a monument to the distance between what is said and what is done, between the promise and the reality, between the contract and its terms. They are 122 sealed spaces where human beings lived and died and made their choices, documented in terminals and holotapes, and the physical evidence of spaces that still hold the shape of lives, where children drew pictures on the walls of facilities that were never going to deliver what their parents had been told, where musicians played instruments in rooms designed to compromise them, where a man with a crate of puppets became the most dangerous person in 100 miles, where 5 survivors received a congratulatory message at the end of the worst decades of their lives. All of that is in there. The whole range of what human beings do when put in impossible situations. The whole range of what institutions do when given unchecked power over people. And it's all told through rusty corridors and flickering lights and terminal entries written by hands that are long still, in rooms that no longer smell of anything living. That's the vault. That's always been the vault. And it's worth every hour spent walking through it.